Welcome to Ajax Development with PHP. During this course, we will learn how to write the JavaScript code for an Ajax request, as well as learn how Ajax keeps track of the request and receives results. We will learn how to use PHP to detect Ajax requests and to respond with text, HTML, or JSON. And we will get hands-on experience by crafting several projects in Ajax. We'll create a button for liking or favoriting a blog post. We'll create a form which submits data, handles form errors, and provides a good user experience. We will implement infinite scrolling so that a page keeps loading more content as users scroll downward, and we will offer search suggestions below a search text field as the user types. Don't worry if you're not an expert. I'll walk you through all of the steps. Let's get started learning Ajax development with PHP. The exercise files for this title are arranged by chapter and by movie. And you can find the exercise files that correspond to the movie that you're watching by first looking for the chapter number and then the movie number. In order to make use of the exercise files, you'll first want to make sure that you have a web server and PHP installed. Once everything's installed, then you can copy the folder of exercise files into your web directory or another convenient location. It's always a good idea to make a copy of the file so that you still have the original to refer back to if you make changes. On my Mac, I'm going to put them in my Sites folder in my user directory. I'll option drag the folder to create a new copy. Now your files will be the same as mine at the start of the movie, and you'll be able to work right along with me. Don't forget, you can also use the exercise files to check your work as you go along. If you're a monthly or annual subscriber to lynda.com, you won't have the exercise files that accompany this tutorial, but you can follow along with me. Everything that's in the exercise files we will create during the tutorials. So as long as you continue to work along with me, your files will exactly mirror what's in the exercise files. Remember that you can pause the video or rewind if you need more time to copy something down. In this course, we'll be learning about Ajax development with PHP. So it makes sense that we should begin with the question, what exactly is Ajax? Ajax is an abbreviation of sorts, and it comes from asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. The A from asynchronous, the JA comes from JavaScript, and the X from XML. Even though it's an abbreviation, it's still written as a single word with a capital A and a lowercase JAX. Simply put, Ajax is what enables a web browser to send and receive data in the background. Even though Ajax has a single name, it's not a single technology. It's actually a combination of several technologies working together. It helps if we begin by understanding the history of Ajax. Starting back in 1996, Microsoft and Mozilla, makers of Netscape and Firefox, began experimenting with asynchronous loading of content in web browsers. Asynchronous meaning that the content doesn't all load at the same time. In 1999, Microsoft Internet Explorer 5 added something called XML HTTP ActiveX control. And this was really the first time that we were able to load asynchronous content. Between 2000 and 2002, Mozilla created a standardized XML HTTP request object that was modeled very closely on Microsoft's interface. And it was this standardization that became adopted by all web browsers between 2002 and 2006. Right in the middle of that period, in 2004, Google began using XML HTTP requests to asynchronously load content for Gmail. In 2004, they also used it for Google Suggest. That's what happens when you go to the Google homepage and you start typing, and it makes suggestions as you type of possible searches that come up right below the search box. And then in 2005, they began using it for Google Maps. Now, Google was one of the first companies to realize the tremendous promise of using XML HTTP request, but it was not just Google. Flickr, Amazon, and contact.com were some of the other early adopters. Up until this point, it's still just a technique for using several different technologies together. The moment when Ajax really caught fire with web developers was when it was given a name and explained how you could use it in an article by Jesse James Garrett of Adaptive Path. His article, Ajax, A New Approach to Web Applications, came out in February of 2005. It's still available online, and it's still a great introduction to the topic. Before Ajax, all web pages used the classic HTTP model. Let's make sure that we understand that first. The user performs an action, for example, they click on a link. An HTTP request is sent from the browser to the server. The server processes the request, and then the server returns HTML back to the browser. One of the key parts here, though, is that the user must wait for those server responses. It has to wait for the new page to be received and to load in the user's browser. By contrast, Let's now look at the Ajax model described by Mr. Garrett. First, the web page loads JavaScript. Mr. Garrett refers to this as the Ajax engine, though few people actually use that term today. Then when the user performs an action, such as clicking a link, the request goes to the JavaScript first, not to the server. That gives JavaScript the opportunity to handle the request directly. Maybe JavaScript already knows what needs to happen. Maybe something on the page just needs to be modified. Some element of the page would be shown or hidden, or maybe a value would be updated. The JavaScript could also validate the data on a form, it could update the navigation, or edit other internal values. JavaScript also has the opportunity to use that XML HTTP request to communicate with the server in the background. And it does that by sending XML asynchronously to the server. So the page is still visible to the user, and in the background, JavaScript can send a request to the server. And then the response data that comes back can then be used in order to update the page. The chief benefit here being that users can continue to interact with the web page without waiting. That can happen in the background, and the user can continue to scroll up and down the page, to click other things, to trigger other Ajax requests as well. Google Maps remains an excellent example of using Ajax. As you drag, you zoom in, you zoom out, or change between satellite, street, or terrain views, the tiles of the map are updated in the background. And throughout it, users maintain the ability to continue interacting with the map. You aren't stuck waiting for your last click to reload a whole new web page. Ajax has become so commonplace that it's easy to overlook it and take it for granted. Now, as I said earlier, Ajax is made up of a group of technologies. There's HTML and CSS, there's XML, there's the XML HTTP request object, and there's JavaScript. I will assume that you have some experience with these already, but if you do not, don't panic, you'll still be able to follow along. We aren't going to dive too deeply into HTML, CSS, XML, or JavaScript, and the basics are easy to grasp. We're going to spend most of our time learning to work with that XML HTTP request object, which is really what enables Ajax to happen. However, if you want to get serious about using Ajax in your own development, then I suggest that you learn more about these other technologies so that you can get the most out of them. In particular, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, in that order, will be the most valuable to you. In this chapter, we're going to learn to work with the client side of Ajax. That is the JavaScript which is loaded into the browser and which sends requests to the web server and then handles the responses that come back from the web server. In the next chapter, we'll look at the server side to see how PHP can respond to those Ajax requests. Let's start by learning how to generate a new Ajax request. As we talked about in the introduction, Ajax requests are enabled by this XML HTTP request object. It's a bit of JavaScript code, actually a JavaScript class that we can use for making our Ajax requests. And there are a few functions that we need to know about to work with it. There's new, there's open, and there's send. Let's take a look at a code example so we can learn how we use new, open, and send with that XML HTTP request object. Again, this is JavaScript code that we're going to be writing. To begin with, I'm going to create a new variable called XHR, and to that variable I'm going to assign a new instance of the XML HTTP request object. I'm saying, JavaScript, take this class and give me a new instance of the class that I can work with. That's how we use new. The variable can be named anything you want, but it's become a bit of a convention to use XHR. First of all, it's a very short variable name, and it does represent the XML HTTP request object, XHR. So whenever we see XHR, we know instantly that that's what we're talking about. Once we have an instance of the class, then we can tell that instance to call its open function. So xhr.open, and then we'll provide 3 arguments to it. The first is the method that we want to use when executing this request. We'll talk more about the methods in just a moment. In this case, it's going to be get. Second, we have the URL, or the page or the script that we want it to actually send its request to. Here I've just got script.php as being the PHP page that we want to send the request. And last of all, true or false for whether this should be an asynchronous request. 99.9% of the time, we want this request to be asynchronous, so that it's sent in the background. That's really the purpose of using Ajax. This open function serves to configure the object so that it can actually make the request, but it doesn't actually make the request yet. In order to make the request, we need to call xhr.getInstance script.send. And that will actually send the GET request asynchronously to script.php. So now let's talk about that GET method that we're passing in as the first argument to open. If you have experience with web development before, then that'll be familiar to you. There are two basic kinds of requests that we can make on the web. There's GET requests and there's POST requests. GET requests are typically what you get when you click a link or when you type a URL into the browser's bar, and it's used for retrieving data only. The alternative would be a POST request, and that's typically what you get when you submit a form to a web server, and that's used for sending or changing data. So we have two different methods that tell the receiving server what it should do with this data. Are we asking to get back data, or are we posting new data which needs to be processed? So we've seen how the process for Ajax works with GET requests. For POST request, it's a little bit different. The first thing is that we're going to need to change the header for the content type. And we do that with another function called setRequestHeader. And we provide the header that we want to set and the value we want to set. You can change lots of different parts of the header of the request. The one that we're interested in with forms, though, is the content type. We want to tell it that the content type that we're going to be sending along is going to be form content. It needs to be encoded as such. So we're going to say that it's the content type and then application/x-www-form-url encoded. It's a long string, but it basically just says, hey, this request contains form data. And then the form data that we want to send also needs to be passed along with the request. It's not enough to just send a request to the page. We want to send data as a package along with it. And we do that by sending the form data as an argument to the send function. Let's take a look at a code example to make this clear. So once again, we create a new variable xhr and we assign an instance of the XML HTTP request object to it. Then we're going to call open, just like we did before, but this time instead of a GET method, we're using a POST method. We're going to be posting form data. We're going to post it to form_process.php, and again, we're going to do that asynchronously. Then though, we also need to take another step, which is to set the request header. This is going to set the request header for the content type to tell it to expect form data and to encode it as such. And then we'll actually call send again, but now we're going to provide the form data. Presumably this was a form that had a first name field into which I typed Bob and a last name field into which I typed Smith. So I'm going to submit first name equals Bob and last name equals Smith. That's my form data, and I'm going to send that along in that send method as an argument. So this is the basic three-step process of sending an asynchronous request to the server. You use JavaScript to create a new XML HTTP request object, you provide a few simple configurations to it, and then you actually send the request, providing any form data if it's necessary. In the next movie, let's learn how to handle the response that comes back from such a request. In the previous movie, we learned how to send an Ajax request. In this movie, we're going to learn how to receive and handle the response that comes back from that request. The first thing you need to know about the Ajax responses is that they can either be text or they can be XML, and we access them in different ways. We're going to use a function called response text when we want to work with the text, and response XML when we want to work with XML. In general, the text is going to be more flexible because the text is just a string of characters. What we get back could be a couple of words or a sentence or a paragraph, or it could be HTML, or it could be JSON. It could be images. It really doesn't matter. It could be any string of characters that gets sent back, whereas XML is only going to be XML. You'll remember though that the X in Ajax actually stands for XML, so it is a central part of the way that Ajax works. Let's take a look at some code as an example. So we're going to create our new XML HTTP request and assign it to XHR. We're going to call open and send on it so that we actually trigger the request. Now, once the server responds, the response is going to come back in and be stored in that same instance, that XHR object that we've been working with. And if we want to access the text version of it, then we ask for xhr.responseText, and that will give us the text response that came back. Here I'm assigning that to a new variable called text. If we want to work with XML, then we do the exact same thing by calling response XML on our XHR object. Here I'm assigning that to a new variable called XML. Once we have that value, we can work with it inside our JavaScript. So let's say that I want to take the response text that came back, and I just want to take the entire text, and I want to put it on the web page inside a div whose ID is main. So I can find that target, which is document.getElementById main. Now I have the div in my JavaScript that I can work with, and I can tell JavaScript that it should update the inner HTML of that div to be equal to text. And that will essentially take that text and have JavaScript put it right in the web page. Now in that case, I'm just working with a block of text, and I'm taking one block of text and just dumping it into one spot. Very frequently though, we want something to be returned that's more complex than just a block of text. And in that case, we'll probably want to parse the response. We're going to want to be able to work with the response and to pick through it and to use some parts of it to do one thing, other parts of it to do something else. Most often when we do that, you're either going to be using XML or JSON. XML is what we get from response XML. It's already parsed, it's ready for us to use. It's well formatted, well structured XML that we can use. We can use get elements by tag name and child nodes, data, in order to work with that XML. You need to know how to work with XML and how to navigate the structure of XML in order to do that. Recently, a more common way to work with it is to use JSON as an alternative to XML. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's another way of passing structured data back in the response that we can then parse. JSON, though, is going to be received as text, and it's up to us to actually parse it. Let me show you an example of a JSON object. So here is a JavaScript object written in JavaScript Object Notation. var person is setting the variable equal to, and then you can see I've got curly braces, and then I've got several strings. They're set up as key value pairs with a colon in between them and a common separating those key value pairs. So first name Bob, last name Smith. So that's what a JSON object actually looks like in JavaScript. So here's what might come back as a response from the server. Now notice that there's a difference here. They're not exactly the same. When we get back the response from the server, what we're getting back is text. Notice the double quotes that are before and after those curly braces. This is a string. It's a string that we're working with, not a JavaScript object notation. Now it looks like a JSON object, but it's not. It's just a string. So we have to tell JSON that it needs to parse that string in order to turn it into a JSON object. And we do that with json.parse, and then we pass in the string. It's that easy. Just tell the JSON object to parse it, and it will turn it into a JSON object for us. Response XML essentially does this for us. When we're working with JSON, we have to take this additional step ourselves. So to show you a full example using JSON, if we had our request that we make, we would get back our response, but then we would call JSON parse on that response to actually get a JSON object, and then we can update the element. In this case, you can see I'm calling json.lastName to just get the last name from the response and put that inside the div. You can pick through the JSON, you can call for its first name, for the last name, for maybe a street address or a zip code, and you can put those in different parts of the page by targeting different parts of the page and parsing the data to get the parts that you want. This will become clearer when we actually do some examples a little later on. We learned how to send requests and we learned how to receive responses. But there's one big piece of the Ajax puzzle that's still missing, and that is, how do we know when a response is ready? There's obviously going to be some elapsed time between when the request is first made and when the response is received. We can't assume that the response is ready right away. That's where states and events come in. The XML HTTP request object has another function called readyState, and it will return a value which indicates the status of the current request. So you simply call xhr.readyState, and you'll get back 1 out of 5 different values. And those values are going to be the numbers 0 through 4. 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And here's what each one means. If we get a 0, it means the connection has been created, but not yet opened. 1 means the connection has been opened. 2 means the request has been sent and received by the server. 3 means that the response is in progress. We've started getting data back, but we only have partial data. 4 means that the response is complete. We either have success or failure, but there's nothing further to do with this request. So when we first start out, we're going to be at 0. And then as we move through each of the steps in the process, the ready state is going to move from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, and finally 4. And we need to wait until we get to state 4 before we use the response. Now we could write a JavaScript loop that would just keep checking this value over and over and over again until we finally get to a ready state of 4. But there's a much better way to do it than that. And that's by using a feature that allows us to detect whenever the ready state changes. The XML HTTP object has another function called onReadyStateChange, all run together, all lowercase, and it's used to store a JavaScript function. And that function, whatever we define as onReadyStateChange, is going to be called each and every time that ready state changes. It doesn't matter what it changes to. It's not like it just waits till we get to ready state of 4. Every time it changes, it's going to run our function again. What it does is it prevents us from having to constantly recheck that value. Instead of checking it over and over and over again, it very kindly says, oh, I just changed to a new value. Would you like me to do anything? And it checks our function. If our function asks it to do something, it will do it. If not, then it will just wait until ready state changes to something else. And when it does, it'll call our function again. Let me show you an example in code. First, let's look at the way that we were doing it before. We instantiate a new HTTP request object, we open it, we send it. And then right away, you can see that I'm calling for XHR response text, and I'm replacing some content inside the current page using that text. But most of the time, this is not going to work because the JavaScripts in line 4 and 5 are going to fire immediately. They're not going to wait for a response. And JavaScript is very fast. So as soon as this request is sent, it's going to try and replace an element in our web page, and it's going to replace it with something blank because we haven't gotten a response back yet. It's just going to disappear. Instead, what we want to do is wait for the response by setting that onReadyStateChange function. So I create my new object, I open it, but then let's stop and add a function to onReadyStateChange. You can see I have onReadyStateChange equals, and I have an anonymous function, function space, and then parentheses, curly braces, and then inside is the content of the function, the JavaScript code that it will execute. So that JavaScript code is going to check and make sure that ready state is equal to 4 before it does anything. You can see that I'm also checking to see if the status is equal to 200. Now we haven't talked about status yet, but that's another function that we can call on the XHR object. It's going to return the current HTTP status code. It's going to be 0 before anything is done at all, but as soon as a request comes back, it will be 200 if it was a success, 404 if the page was not found, or 500 if it was some kind of an error. And there are other status codes that can be returned as well. You can learn more about the HTML spec to see what those are. What I'm essentially saying here is, if the request is complete and it was a success, then run my code. And that's what's going to do. Everything that's in those curly braces after that will get executed, which is when it takes the response and puts it into the current page. Now, I've only defined my function to this point. We've got to remember, we still need to actually call send. That's our last step. We have our function, now we call send. Now, ready state will change. It'll go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and finally 4. And each time it changes, it's going to call our function again. But our code is only going to do anything when we finally get to a ready state of 4. When it gets to 3, it's not going to do anything. Now, the code that you execute when ready state finally gets to 4 can be quite long, and you may not want to put it inside this spot in your definition for onReadyStateChange, in which case you can define other JavaScript functions and then call those inside there. So for example, I've defined a JavaScript function called replaceElementById, pass it an ID and a block of text, and it'll just replace the content on the page. Now, when ready state is equal to 4, I just simply call that function and pass in the arguments that it needs. It can help you to keep the onReadyStateChange function much leaner and clearer. Now, we also could have written code for if ready state was equal to 2, and we could have performed some action in that case, or if ready state was equal to 3. Or we could have written code that said if ready state was equal to 4, but status was equal to 404. In other words, we didn't get a success back, we got a page not found error instead. In every one of those cases, we can handle it differently. This is the most common one, which is let's wait for us to get to a success page and then use the results. But you could write other variations of it as well. The main idea is that it runs this onReadyStateChange function every time the state changes, and then my code executes only when the ready state equals the value that I've provided. Now that we know how to handle Ajax requests, server responses, and also how to inspect the current state and trigger code whenever that state changes, we're ready to put it all together in our first example. We'll create a simple HTML page which will load new text from another file asynchronously by using Ajax. I'm going to start out with a bit of code in a couple of separate files. You can see that I've got them in a directory here called Ajax_text, and the first file is index.html, and the second is new_content.txt. These are also included in the exercise files if you have access to those. They're pretty simple. Let's open them up in the Atom text editor to take a look. So when I drag the folder into Atom, it opens it up in project view. Let's look at new content.txt first. It's just a very simple text file with just a single sentence in it. This is the new content which has been loaded by Ajax. That's the content that I'm going to be loading in. So you can use any text you want for that. Here's the HTML file. It's a basic HTML page, nothing really special about most of it. I have a div here with the ID of main, and inside there I've got some starting text. This is the original text when the page first loads. Then I've got a button declared. The button has an ID of Ajax-button. It's of type button, and the text on that button just says update content with Ajax. And then I've got some skeletal JavaScript here. Now the JavaScript that I've got is got a declaration for replace text, which has no code inside it yet. We're going to write that together in a moment. And then I've got some code here which uses JavaScript to bind an event to that button. So this is a regular thing that you would do in JavaScript. We tell the document to find the element, the Ajax button, assign that to button, and then I tell that button to add event listener for click. So whenever it receives a click, then what should it do? It should call this function, replace text. So then it will call this function right up here, replace text. So every time it gets a click, that's what the button will do. Now you might be tempted to use onClick instead as part of the button. We don't want to do that. We want to use the event listener, and that has to do with the way that JavaScript scopes some of its functions. In order to have all the parts of JavaScript available to us in the right scope, we want to use add event listener. And that's a best practice way to do this. Now, before we do anything else, let's just bring this up in a browser. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you've got that located inside a web directory where you can access it in a browser. So that's inside your document root or somewhere else that you have access to it. For me, that's inside my user directory, inside my sites directory. I'm going to go into Firefox and I'll access that by going to localhost and then tilde Kevin Skogland and then Ajax_text. Now that's the URL that I'm using. That URL may very well be different for you depending on what kind of system you're using and how you have things set up. For example, maybe you just use localhost Ajax text, or maybe you have to put in documents or something else, depending on where it's located. But for me, this is the way that I locate that file. Now, of course, I have to have my web server running, so you want to make sure that you have the web server running and that you're able to get back pages. If you aren't, troubleshoot that first before you move on. Okay, so now I'm just basically showing an HTML page. That's really all that's happening here. There's no Ajax going on really at all. I'm just loading an HTML page and I'm telling it that it should add a listener on that button to call a function which does nothing. And sure enough, if we click on it, nothing happens at all. Before we actually start writing our code, I want to show you one other thing that's super useful whenever you're working with JavaScript, and especially with Ajax, and that is how to set up the console. From Firefox, I have Web Developer Tools as a shortcut right here. Web Console is one of my options. Or I can go up here to Tools, Web Developer, and get to the Web Console that way. When I have my Web Console open, you'll see that I have this box down here at the bottom of my window, and it allows the browser to receive information to tell me what's going on. And later we'll actually be able to post some information in there, which can help us in debugging. So you'll see me open that console from time to time, and now you'll know how to do it. Okay, so now that we're all set up, we're ready to go, let's actually write the Ajax code that we need inside replace text so that we'll issue an Ajax request and then take the response and put it inside div ID main to replace this content with the remotely loaded content. So we know the first thing we want to do, we want to create a new XHR object. New XML HTTP request. And then we're going to tell XHR that it should open. And what do we want to open? We want to open with a GET request. We're going to be getting information back, so it's a GET request. And the URL we're going to use is just going to be new_content.txt. And then we want it to be an asynchronous request, so we put true at the end. Now this path might be slightly different for you depending on where you've put it, but as a relative path, it should work. It should be relative to this current page, so it should still work in all cases. And then after we have XHR open, we know that we need XHR send, and that will actually send our request. But remember, we don't want to just send it right away. We want to have defined that on ready state change, and that's going to be equal to a function. I'll put a space here. And now we need to define that function. What do we want to do when the state changes? Let's do, first we'll do one that's if XHR ready state with a capital S is equal to 2. Now remember, that's not when it's done. That's when it's first issuing the request. I'm going to go ahead and put one in here for that. And then I'm going to make another one. I'll just copy that. That says if ready state is equal to 4, and that means that it's complete. So I'm going to have two different ones here. XHR status is also equal to 200. So when that's true, we want to have it put the response text into that element main. So I'm going to first find my target equals document get element by ID. That's JavaScript that allows us to traverse the HTML DOM, and it's going to find an element whose ID is main. There should only be one, and there it is right there. So that's going to find it and assign it to target, and then I can address commands directly to that element. So the command that we're going to use is target.inner HTML. We're going to set the inner HTML to be equal to xhr.response text. Whatever we get back, that's what we're going to set it to. Now I'm also going to take this target, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to move it up here to the top before we even initiate this new item. So it's already available to me, and that allows me to use it twice because I'm going to use it again here. I'm going to say inner HTML equals, and in this case I'm going to make it say loading. All right, so now if ready state is equal to 2, that inner HTML will be equal to loading, and then when it's finally done and it gets to ready state 4, then inner HTML will be equal to the response text. All right, so let's try it out. Let's save this whole thing. Let's go back over to Firefox. We'll reload our page. I'm going to do that by actually going up here and hitting return so that it loads the page fresh. I don't get a cached copy. And I'm going to click my button. See how that worked? This is the new content which has been loaded by Ajax. It worked for us, just like that. Now that loading went by pretty fast. You may not have been able to see it. One good way to see it is just to not replace it anymore. Let's take that and comment that out. Let's go back. We'll reload our page. Update content. You see loading appeared. And then when it got to ready state 4, it didn't actually do anything. So loading was still just sitting there. So had it been a slow connection, then we would have seen loading for a while. But because we're running on a local machine, it happens very, very fast. It puts loading there and then right away replaces it with the actual text that we want. Now I mentioned that the console was useful. Let's put a line here. We'll use some JavaScript. We'll call console.log. And then in parentheses, we can have it log whatever information we want. Let's have it just log ready state and then plus xhr.ready state. So now it should log that ready state each and every time that we go through it. Let's try it again. Let's reload the page, update the content, and notice here ready state 2, ready state 3, ready state 4, right? Each one of those happened. Now we didn't see ready state 1 happened because we had already opened the connection. So we just got ready state 2, 3, and 4. As we changed from 1 to 2, it triggered it. As it changed from 2 to 3, it triggered it again, and then it changed from 3 to 4. It triggered it again. This console log can be very useful. You can troubleshoot a lot of things by dropping console log into your JavaScript code to make sure that you've got it all working correctly. That's the fundamentals of how we work with Ajax on the client side. If any of that wasn't clear, go back and review the last few movies and make sure that you understand these basics before we move on. Since the creation of Ajax, JSON has become a more popular way to transfer structured data than by using XML. In large part, this is because JSON is ready for use inside our JavaScript code, while XML requires navigating the XML structure, which can be cumbersome. To demonstrate how to use JSON, we could simply send JSON back from a static file, just like we sent back text in the last movie. However, there are many excellent third-party APIs which return JSON, and I think it's useful for us to try to use one of those instead. So let's try an example which uses the popular Google Maps API. You can see that I've added a new directory to my sites directory called Ajax_zip_code, and it has one file in it called index.html. This will be in your exercise files if you have access to those, but it's also a very simple file that you could write yourself. Inside the text editor, we'll take a look. We see that we have a basic HTML page. Has a little bit of style information up here, mostly just to add some margin around a couple of things to make it look a little nicer. And then you can see that I've got a div with an ID of entry, and inside there is an input. This is a text input. It's a form field. It's actually not part of a form. It's just a standalone text input. There's no reason I have to have a full form here. I just want to have that kind of HTML element so that the user can enter a zip code. And then you can see that I've got an Ajax button, just like we had before. This one says submit. So the idea is that the user will type in a zip code, they'll hit submit, and then we'll send that zip code to the Google Maps API, and it will return back location information for us. Then we'll take that location information, we'll parse it, and we'll put it into this div with ID location. You can see I've got some placeholder JavaScript down here as well. The first thing is I've got a variable that defines the basic URL to reach the Google Maps API. Now Google asks for all users of their APIs to sign up for an API key. It's a free key, so there's no reason not to do it. It's just a way for Google to keep track of who's using their services. Now for simple tests, at least at the moment, you don't have to have an API key to make this work. But if you're going to be using it frequently, or if you're going to be putting it onto a production machine, then you do want to go out and get an API key to use. You can see I've got placeholders for a find location function. That's going to be my actual Ajax call to the API. And then when it gets back results, it's going to take that data and it's going to call the output location function in order to put that data in the right spot in the DOM. And then you can see down here that I'm binding another event using add event listener for a click, and this time it's calling find location. That's this function that's right up here. So before we get to work on writing all that, let's bring it up in a browser and see what it looks like. Let's go into Firefox, and instead of Ajax text, it's now going to be Ajax zip code. So this is what it looks like. So let's say I type in 90210, I click submit, and you'll see I don't get anything back at the moment. It's binding to that function, but that function actually doesn't do anything. Now, before we go over and actually start using this, I just want you to see how it actually works. Here's a URL for maps.googleapis.com, and you can see that it has a question mark, address equals, and then I've got a zip code, 90210, and when you submit that, this is what gets returned to you. This is JSON data. That's how it's being structured. It's JSON data coming back telling us what Google knows about this address, this zip code, 90210. The part that I want to use is this bit right down here, formatted address. So we want to be able to parse the results and find that formatted address, and that's what we want to put into the web page. Okay, so now that we've seen it, we can come back and reference it anytime we want. Let's start writing our code. So inside find location, the first thing we need to do is we need to get the zip code that the user has entered up here in the text input. So var zip code equals document get element by ID, and it's zip code. Now that's this ID right here. That's the unique identifier for this HTML element. So I'm finding that element and I'm assigning it to zip code. Next, let's figure out the URL that we're going to be submitting to. It's going to be that API variable that's up above, but remember we also need to add question mark address equals plus, and then we want to put the actual zip code. Now, it's not just zip code, that's the HTML element. What I want is the value that's inside that element. So don't get confused there. Zip code is an HTML element. Zip code value is the value that's been typed into that element. All right, so that'll give me the URL that I want to hit. Now let's paste in some code here. Let me just make this nicely formatted by indenting it. Now we've done this a couple times now, so you can follow along with me. You can see I'm creating my new XML HTTP request object. I'm calling open with get and then URL. That's the variable that we just created up here. It's going to be asynchronous. I've got onReadyState change defined, and it's going to be a function. If ready state is less than 4, anything less than 4, it's going to call another function called showLoading. We don't have that written. We'll come back to that in a second. When the ready state is equal to 4 and status is equal to 200, we'll know that it's done. And then we're going to call another function, which is output location, and we're going to pass in the response text. Now we're getting back JSON data, but it's coming in through response text. It's up to us to treat it as JSON. It just comes in as that generic response text, and it's up to us to do something with it. And then, of course, we've got to send that request at the end. Okay, so now let's write a new function, and this one is going to be show loading. So what I have in mind here is that we'll just put in text that says loading when we start the process, and then we'll replace that with the actual data once we have a location. So the target is going to be document get element by ID location, and the target inner HTML is going to be equal to just the string loading. Now I'm going to take that target again and come down here, because when we output the data, we're going to output it to the same spot. The data that we want to put there this time is going to be the data that comes back from the JSON. Now remember, this is a string when it comes back. It's not actually JSON. We talked about that before. In order to turn it into JSON, we need to call json.parse on the data. Now we convert it from a string into actual JSON, and then we can work with it as JSON. So the address that we're going to be using is going to be JSON dot, and we can go back if you want to take a look here. This will give you a hint on how we traverse it. We're going to ask for its results. That has an array. We want to ask for the first element of the array, and then formatted address. So let's come back here. We'll say results, and then the first element of that array, which is the 0 index, and then formatted address. That's how we traverse the JSON to get the value that we're looking for. And then we can say target.inner HTML is going to be equal to the address. Okay, let's try it. Let's save it. Make sure that everything's working. We'll come back over here. We'll go to this page. We want to reload the page because we actually want to get the new JavaScript on this page. If I just click submit, nothing changed because this is loading the existing JavaScript on this current page. I have to reload the HTML page. Now it has all my new JavaScript. I'll type in 90210. I'll click submit, and you see what it gives me back. Beverly Hills, California, 90210. So let's review. We bound a function to the submit and told it that it was an Ajax function. And whenever that's clicked, it goes and it gets the value that was entered by the user in this text box, and it submits it to the Google Maps API. That API sends back JSON. We take the JSON and we parse it for the parts that we want, and we take those parts and we put them on the page in the places that we want. jQuery is a very popular JavaScript framework. So far, we've been writing our Ajax requests and response handling in pure JavaScript. Many developers use jQuery to write their Ajax code too. I'm sure that there are many watching this course who are already using jQuery and plan to use it to write their Ajax code. In this movie, I want us to take a quick detour to see how you could write the same code in jQuery. First, here's the pure JavaScript version that we've been working with. We create a new XML HTTP request object, then we call open, set it up for where it should go, what kind of request it should be, and where the script is located. Then we set up our callback function for onReadyState change. Every time the state changes, we're going to have the opportunity to check what the state is, to check what the status is, and handle it appropriately. And finally, we call send to actually trigger the request. Now here's the jQuery version. $.ajax, and then parentheses, we configure it with whatever we want to do. Notice the similarity between the top section and the code we had for open on the previous slide. Both of them have get, they have the URL, and they have async equals to true. In jQuery, we also don't have to specify async equals true, it's going to be assumed. Notice that we also don't specify send. They were both opening and sending it in one step. If we had form data, then we could provide it where it says data. The data type that we're going to be working with is going to be text, but jQuery also makes it easy to request different data types, such as JSON, HTML, XML, or even JavaScript code. And then we can write a success callback with our function and use jQuery style selectors to make it easier to update content in the document. This is very similar to what we were doing with checking for ready state and seeing if it was complete and if it was a success. That's the case in which we'll call this function, which in this case finds a div with ID main and updates its HTML to be equal to data. You can see that that's a lot more concise. That's one of the things that jQuery gives you. And we also can have another callback for error. in the case when we do get to ready state 4, but we get an error back instead, and that would be a different function. There are other features as well, like the ability to set timeout values and to handle different kinds of errors. There's also a shorthand form. $.get is going to be a get Ajax request. In this case, we don't have to specify get as one of the options. We can just specify the URL, the data type, and our success function. It makes for a very small way to write an Ajax script. It can be very effective. If we want to do a post request, it would be very similar. $.post, and then the data that we wanted to send in the post request. The thing that I want you to see is that while the syntax between the two is different, the principles are the same. In this course, we're going to learn Ajax without using jQuery. In other words, we're going to write the raw JavaScript. Then, if you want to use jQuery, it will be easy for you to later apply what you've learned. In the previous chapter, we learned how Ajax works on the browser or client side. In this chapter, we'll be looking at how the server receives and responds to Ajax requests, and we'll begin by learning how to write code which can detect an Ajax request. When Ajax code requests a URL, it's going to hit a PHP page on the web server which can respond to the request. And we have the ability to write that PHP page in two different ways. The page could assume that all requests that come into that page are always going to be from Ajax. That's the simplest thing, right? We just say this page is only going to be accessed by Ajax, and we can assume that from the start. More often though, I think you're going to want to have your page detect whether or not the request was Ajax. That way we have the ability to handle regular requests and Ajax requests differently. It might be that we only want to respond to Ajax requests, and if it's a regular request, we'll just do nothing. Or maybe the regular request should return a full HTML page, while the Ajax request should return a partial page, or maybe it should return JSON data instead. You get the idea. But here's the problem. A regular request and an Ajax request look the same to the web server. A GET request to a URL is simply a GET request to a URL. There's no additional data being sent to identify it as having originated with Ajax. But fortunately, we can add that additional data so that we can identify it. And we can do that by adding a request header. We'll add information to the request header specifically for the value of x-requested-with. Here's how you do it. In our JavaScript code, we're going to take our XHR object, and before we actually send the request, we're going to set the request header to be x-requested-with a value, a string that we're going to provide, telling it what it was requested with. You could use absolutely any string you want here. You could put Ajax, for example. However, the convention has become to use XML HTTP request. And that makes sense. That's what we are requesting it with. We're requesting it with that object. And many frameworks, such as jQuery, do this process for you automatically. So if you do it the same way, you're going to be following the common convention. Then, in our PHP code, we have the ability to find that value inside PHP's server variables. It'll be located as HTTP_x_requested_with. You can see here I've got a PHP function called isAjaxRequest that checks for that value. It checks to see is it set and has it been set to XML HTTP request. If it is, then this function will return true, and we'll know it is an Ajax request. If either of one of those conditions is not met, it will return false. Then we can use it inside a conditional. If isAjaxRequest, then we can echo back an Ajax response. If it's not an Ajax request, then we'll echo back a non-Ajax response. You get the idea. One footnote to this though, these header values are not secure. That is that they can be spoofed. So rely on them as a convenience, but don't ever count on them as a way to prevent users from making different kinds of requests. They can still spoof the system if they wanted to. To recap, regular and Ajax requests look the same to the server, but we can add data to the request headers of our Ajax requests so that then our PHP code can tell the difference. In this movie, we will write our first Ajax response using PHP. Often when responding to an Ajax request, we will want to return either simple text or a small portion of HTML. We typically don't want to return a full HTML page. That is, everything from the beginning HTML tag, the header, the body tags, all of that. Usually what we want is just to return a small portion, a fragment of HTML, which we can call a partial. So we're going to take that partial and we're going to return that back. And then when we get it into our Ajax as a response, we can use that bit of HTML to update a small portion of the page. So the output for the response, what we're sending back to the Ajax request, is just going to be text that's in our PHP page or text that we've echoed out using PHP. The same way as if we were outputting something to HTML. It works exactly the same way. You don't want to use return or anything like that. Content that's on the page or that we use PHP echo to put on the page is what will be returned in the response. And we can simply write text or HTML. If we write text, then the response will be text. If we write HTML, then what we respond with will be HTML. Let's try an example. I have a new directory here in Sites called Ajax_HTML. This is included in your exercise files, but it's also an exact copy of Ajax_text that we were working with earlier. That's the first one that just simply replaces content on the page. I've only made a couple of changes to it. Let's take a look. You'll notice that first of all, I named the page that gets hit by the Ajax as new content.php instead of new content.txt. The content's exactly the same. I just changed the file ending. Then you'll also notice that in index.html, I've changed it so that new content is hitting .php because now the file name has changed. But that's really all I've changed so far. Let's go back to Firefox and let's just change this to Ajax HTML. There we are. Update content. And you can see that it updates it. Everything works exactly the way we left it from the last chapter. What I want to do now though is I want to come back to this new content.php and I want to make this a PHP response. Now, this is a pretty good hint as to what we're going to return, right? Here it was just text. That's all it is. Now, it doesn't matter if I have PHP tags somewhere in here and I'm doing PHP to process it. The end result is this is the output. Whatever gets put on this page, either as static text or as dynamically generated text by PHP. It really doesn't matter. So for example, let's say that we have PHP and let's have just a simple var, and we'll call it new content. And then down here, instead of having new content, let's open up some PHP tags and echo var. Let's save our page. Let's go back over. Let's reload it from scratch. Update content. And we get the exact same thing back, right? It really doesn't matter whether it's static text or whether it's dynamically generated by PHP. This is what gets returned as the result of the response that we're sending back. And if we add HTML into there, then it works exactly the same way. Let's put strong tags around this. Strong. And let's also put span tags around the whole thing. And let's give it a style. We'll say color blue. All right, so now we go back. We reload the page. Update content. Look at that. We get the new content and it includes the HTML. We can actually check that by clicking on the inspector down here right next to console, and this will let us look and see what the content is on the page. So we open up main, you can see the span, color blue. This is the new content which has been loaded by Ajax, right? That's what's in the DOM at the moment, and it's just simply what was returned back. So if you write text, you're going to get back text. If you write HTML, then you're going to get back HTML. There's one other thing that I want to show you before we leave this though, which is a useful technique for debugging content. It can be tricky to debug Ajax responses because we don't have access to this page directly. Especially that's true with post requests. If this had been a post request, then this page that we were originally on would have been the thing submitting it. All right, we don't have a direct way to get to the page. We have to submit to it, and then we have to get back its response. You can always stop anywhere inside your PHP code here, and you could have it say echo $var, and then put in return. That'll exit the script and none of this will get executed. It'll just stop everything cold right there. Echo var and return. Let's come back over here and let's try that. Let's reload the page just so we start fresh. Update content. And you see that I just got back that variable, right? It was a way for me just to see what was in there. And we can also do the same thing by coming over here and logging what comes back. We can log the response text. And that way we can see what are we actually getting back at different points. It's a useful way to be able to debug these requests because sometimes they can end up being a little bit more like a black box. I'm just going to comment that out for now because we don't actually want to do that. That would just be for debugging that value. What we actually want is for the rest of the script to keep going. So just keep that in mind. If you ever get stuck, You can always echo a variable and then return, and that's what will be sent back as the response. And then you can either display it or you can log it into the console so that you can troubleshoot it. In the previous movie, we used PHP to be able to return text or HTML. In this movie, let's learn how we can use PHP to send back JSON data as the response. The reason that we might want to use JSON data is because it allows us to return structured and labeled data, and that can be really useful. We can then pass that data back to JavaScript, and it's ready for use in JavaScript. JavaScript can iterate through it, it can pick out the pieces that it needs, and then it can use that information, that data that we've passed back, in order to make changes to our page. If we're only passing back a single item, like a bit of text or a bit of HTML, then it makes sense to do it that way. But if we want to pass it back multiple pieces of data, then JSON is probably the way we want to go. The way that we would write JSON data in our PHP page is the same as we did for HTML. You write JSON in order to return JSON. Whatever you put in that page is what's going to get returned. Now, we're not actually returning JSON, we're going to be returning a string representation of JSON. Once we get it back into our JavaScript, then it's going to be up to JavaScript to take that string and convert it into true JSON. But it's going to look just like JSON. For all practical purposes, we can call it JSON when it's still in PHP. Since PHP 5.3, there's also a function which can help us to convert PHP structures into JSON. It's called JSON encode, and it's very useful. For example, here I'm taking a basic associative array, I'm calling JSON encode on it, and I get back a string that has JSON in it. So you can see I've got the curly braces and I've got the key value pairs with colons in between and commas between each one of them, just the way that JSON likes it. If I have just a basic array, that is a non-associative array, I can also use JSON encode on it, but I'll get back something that looks more like a typical array, not an associative array, but just a list of items with commas in between. There are also several additional options that you can plug into JSON encode, and you can refer to the php.net website to find out all of the options. But the most useful one is probably JSON force object. It's all caps because it's actually a constant, and what we wanted to say is that if you take that same array, the ABC array, and we call JSON force object, well then it's going to turn it into an object structure. That is, it's going to use the indexes as the keys and then the elements of the array as the values. So you can see how we use the same array and we generated two different types of JSON based on what we called on it. Another really interesting use of JSON encode is when we have a PHP class. We can take that class, we can instantiate it, and then we can call JSON encode on that instance. And guess what it'll give us back? It'll get us JSON that contains all of the public attributes of that class. Notice that I have attributes for first name and last name with their values. Notice that I also did not get secret name as one of the attributes because it's a private attribute of the class. Only the public ones get listed. So it actually converts our instance of this class into JSON. That can be super useful, especially if we're working a lot with classes and object-oriented programming. We can pull data out of the database and easily convert it into JSON and just send back the JSON to the request. There's also another function in PHP called JSON decode if you ever need it to go the other way. That is to take JSON and turn it into a PHP entity such as an array. Let's try using this in an example case. So on my desktop, you'll see that I've added another folder here, Ajax_JSON. This is going to be inside your exercise files if you have them, but it's also pretty much a copy of what we were just doing with Ajax_HTML. The one difference is that I've changed new content.php, and instead of returning what we had before, now I've got an array. This is a PHP array that we're working with. It's an associative array. It has keys for short, regular, and long, and then it has values for each one of those. So I have a very short version of the content, a regular version, and a long version. Now I've just put that into a single variable called content. Now if I want to return JSON as the response back to this page when it calls, then all I have to do is write JSON. So I could write back, for example, that we're going to have content is going to be something, right? That's all I have to do. That looks like JSON. I can just put that in there, and that's what gets sent back in the response. Now, if I want to take this array and have that output, then I need to just call JSON encode on the content. Now that's not going to work by itself though, right? Because this will encode it, but then what will happen? It will do nothing with it. We have to also output it to the template. So it's very important that we use that echo so that we echo back what we've encoded. That puts it on this page dynamically, and now it's going to be sent back as the response. Let's take a look. Let's bring it up in a browser, and let's go to Ajax JSON. Here's the page, update content. Look at that. I got back all that content. Now what I got back was a string, and it took that string and it just dumped it in there because that's what I told it to do. If you look back at index.html, replace text, takes the response, and it just puts it inside that inner HTML. Now, if we want to pick through it and choose the content we want, well, then we have to parse that text. We can't just take it as a string. We want to turn it into JSON first. JSON is going to equal to json.parse, and then the response text. Now we have true JSON. Now we can go through it and get the parts that we want. So let's say that we want to take the regular, that's the one we want, then we'll say target inner HTML is going to be equal to JSON regular. All right, let's go back and let's try that again. Let's reload our page. Let's update content with Ajax. There it is. Now we're getting the new content which has been uploaded by Ajax. And we can test that by also asking for short. Let's go back. Again, we need to completely reload this page each time because the JavaScript is already on the page, right? The JavaScript exists on this HTML page. We need to reload it. And now we have new JavaScript, which tells it to find the new one. And then just for good measure, let's do the one for long, save it. Again, got to reload the page to get the new JavaScript, update the content, and we get back the longer version. See how that works? Now we're able to pass back structured data with labels. We're able to pick and choose what we want out of that response. In this movie, we'll apply what we've been learning in this chapter to see how to update a web page when an element on the page changes. You'll see that I've got another directory here inside sites directory called Ajax_category select. This is included in the exercise files if you have access to those. Let's open them up in our Atom text editor and take a look. First, let's look at index.html. This is going to be a basic HTML page, and it has a div which has an ID of form. Now, it's not actually a form. It would have a form tag if that were the case. I'm just simulating or suggesting the idea of a form. On that form, though, we have a question. Which category are you interested in? Then maybe we're asking a customer for more information, or maybe this is a form that's allowing someone who's using our website to get to the kind of information that they're looking for on the website. So we have a category select, and this is a select option. That's the kind of drop-down menu where you click on it, you choose an option. The first one is going to just say, please select. It's disabled so that we can't actually choose it, but it is selected right at the start. And then we have three options, furniture, lighting, or accessories. Those are our main categories, and they have values of 1, 2, and 3 associated with each one. Then we have another select for subcategory select, which is empty. There are currently no options. What I want to do is I want to be able to send an Ajax request whenever the category select changes and have the result that comes back be a list of subcategories that we can use to populate the second select. If we take a look at our JavaScript, you can see I've already got quite a bit of that written out. Let's jump down below update subcategories and first see the event binding that we're doing. So we have get element by ID down here, and it's looking for category select. So it's going to find that category selector, and then it's going to tell that selector to add an event listener on change. Before we've been working with click, now we're working with change. So whenever it changes, it's going to call the function update subcategories. Update subcategories is similar to the Ajax functions we've been working with in the past. We're going to find the category selector and the subcategory selector so that we can work with them. We're going to figure out what the currently selected value is. We're going to do that by telling the selector to take all of its options and then return the option that has the selected index. Now that's not the ID, that's the selected index. It's either 0, 1, 2, or 3. It's the index used by select to know which one has been picked. So that's how we know which option is selected, and then we can get its value to get the actual ID. So once we have the value, we'll know the category ID. We'll be able to send a request. It's going to be a GET request that we'll send to subcategories.php category ID equal to that category ID that we just found. We'll send an Ajax request, and when the response comes back, we'll just update the subcategory selector with the response text for now. Okay, so that all should be pretty straightforward. We've seen that before. Let's take a look at subcategories.php. At the beginning, I just have a list of categories. Now, this is the kind of information that would be great to put in a database, but rather than try to build a whole database just for this one example, I'm going to simulate that by having an array with arrays inside of it. So we have a categories array, and the first category is furniture, then we've got lighting, and then we've got accessories. And each one of those has subcategories. And if we look at those subcategories, you'll see we've got beds, benches, cabinets, chairs and stools, consoles and desks, sofas and tables. And then for lighting, we've got ceiling, floor, table, wall. And for accessories, we have mirrors, outdoor and patio, pillows, rugs, wall decor, and art. Okay, so those are the subcategories. What we want to do is be able to find the currently selected category and then return its subcategories as options. Down here, I've already got code written to find out what the current category ID is that's been sent in as a parameter in our GET request. Then to go through each of the categories and check to see if the current category ID matches that ID, then we'll know that that's the current category that's being requested. Then all we have to do is find its subcategories and return something back to the Ajax. Okay, so now we have to make a choice though. What are we going to return? We can return HTML. We can actually put together an HTML string with option tags and all the ID values that we need and send that back. Or we can send back JSON. We saw how to do that in the last movie. We could send back just this array right here and call JS encode on it and pass that back. And then our JavaScript could take care of assembling the string that it needs to put into that spot. It's really up to you. Both approaches work. If you happen to be really good at JavaScript, you may prefer the second approach. You may want to just stick with working with JavaScript. For me, I find it much easier to work in PHP and to work writing my HTML right here on this page. So that's what I'm going to do here. So instead of having this, now we're going to say, well, we know what our subcategories ought to be. Subcategories equals the current category, the one that we're working with, and its subcategories. All right, so then let's make another loop that'll go through each of those. I'm just going to copy and paste that in so you don't have to watch me type it and I won't make mistakes. Just indent that a bit. There we go. Let's take a look at it together. So for each of the subcategories, as subcategory, I'm going to loop through, and for each one, I'm going to output the option, the value, which is its ID, and then subcategory name will be the label that we see, and then we'll close the option tag. So it's going to loop through, and for each one, it's going to generate that option, and because I'm echoing it, I'm dynamically outputting that to this page, therefore it gets returned. Let's try it all out. Save it. Let's go to Firefox, and let's try loading up of Ajax JSON category select. There we are. What category are you interested in? You can see right now there's nothing in that subcategory. Please select. I have furniture, lighting, and accessories. And when I choose furniture, voila, beds, benches, cabinets, you see the list. When I change it again to lighting, it sends another Ajax request. It comes back with a different value. Accessories, there we go, mirrors, right? Every time I do it, it makes another request to the server to get those values. Now I want to make one more improvement before we leave this. If we load the page to begin with, we have this empty subcategory here, and that's just not very attractive. So I'm going to go back to my index.html page, and up at the top in the head section, I'm going to add style tags. Style. And in there, I'm going to put one style, which is going to be subcategory select. I'm going to tell it display none. So now it should not show. Let's go back, reload our page. Sure enough, it doesn't show. Well, it's not going to show all the time. Even if I populate with data, it's still going to be hidden. I need to add another line down here that says after I've populated the inner HTML with my result, let's also tell subcat select to make a change to its style. Style display equals inline, and that will make it appear again. All right, so let's go back and let's try that out. Reload the page. It's not showing. As soon as I choose furniture, now it appears. It populates and it appears. And it stays there all the time now. It's only not visible when nothing is selected. And it's not possible to choose please select again, right? It's disabled. So I'm always choosing an option. So it's okay if it stays visible all the time. You also could have an alternative version of this where you could make it invisible again as well. But for our purposes, that works great. Hopefully by now, you're beginning to feel comfortable with this process. The idea of submitting a JavaScript request to the server, having PHP assemble a response that it sends back, and then having the JavaScript handle that response in the browser in a way that's appropriate. In this chapter, we'll build a small-scale project to demonstrate how to create asynchronous buttons using Ajax and PHP. Asynchronous buttons have become common in modern web applications. The idea is that there's a small button or a link or an icon or something that you click on the page, and it makes a small update to the application state. Maybe you're liking a status post that someone has put on Facebook, or you're favoriting an article that you liked, or reacting to something, or maybe you have a blog post and you want to publish it. All of these things can change the state of the application without us having to reload the page. It's especially useful when there's a lot of items on the page and we just want to quickly make a change to an item by pressing a button. The process in every case is the same. We notify the server about the change, the server updates the database so that it can keep track of the change, and then it can visually indicate the change to the user on the web page so they can see that the change succeeded. In our project, we're going to create a button which will allow us to mark one of several blog posts as a favorite. I have a new project started inside my sites directory called Ajax_button. This is included in the exercise files if you have those. If not, you can certainly create your own. Let's start with index.php and take a look at what's there. So it's a basic HTML page. At the very beginning, I'm initializing my sessions in PHP, and that's because I'm going to be using the sessions to keep track of which blog posts have been marked as favorites. Now, in the real world, we probably would set up a database, we probably would have lots of users, and then we would mark which user had favorited which blog post, right? We'd store that in the database so we'd have it in the future. But that's an awful lot of work to go through, and it's really not relevant to the Ajax work that we're trying to do. So we're going to cheat a bit and fake the database by having session favorites. And we're going to have one user, and that's us, with a set of blog posts, and we're going to store what our favorites are. We're just going to store it in the session so we can keep track of them. And that'll serve as a stand-in for the database. If we scroll down, you'll see that I've got a bit of basic style information. We'll take a look at what that looks like when we view it in the browser in a moment. And then you can see that I've got a series of blog posts. In a div with ID blog posts, I've got div with ID blog post 1, class is blog post, and then it's got some placeholder content in it, blog post 101, and some lorem ipsum text inside the paragraph tags. Then after that, I've got my button. So here's the button, class is favorite button, the text says favorite, and it's a button that we can click. And the idea is that we'll click that button and it will mark this particular blog post as being our favorite. But there's not just one blog post, we have several. So here's blog post 102 and blog post 103, and each of those also has a favorite button. So it's going to be important that we're able to tell these apart. Before, when we've been working with Ajax, we just had a single Ajax button that performed one action. Now we have many buttons that all perform similar actions, but they're slightly different because in each case we want to affect a different blog post. And then down at the bottom, you can see that we've got some placeholder for our JavaScript. Favorite is the name of the function we're going to call. You can see that we've got a basic XML HTTP request in there, the kind of thing that we've been working with before. Notice that I'm setting the request header here to set requested with to XML HTTP request. Now, when I'm doing the event binding, because I have several buttons, I have to do it a bit differently. Now, instead of getting an element by its ID, I have to get elements, plural, by their class name. So I'm finding all elements who have a class name of favorite button. If you look up here, all of my buttons have that class name. Every single one, class is favorite dash button. So it's going to find all of those. That's going to be my buttons. Then I've got a JavaScript loop that goes through, I starting at 0, while I is less than the length of buttons that we have, and incrementing I each time. It loops through. So for each time we go through the buttons, we tell it to take item 0, item 1, item 2, item 3, etc. So it brings up each button in turn, and it adds an event listener to it. So each one of these gets the event listener for click. And when it's clicked, then it will call favorite. Okay, we'll come back and work more on that in just a moment when we actually work on sending the request. Let's go ahead and save that file. Let's take a look at favorite.php and see what we've got there as a placeholder. So when this page is called by our Ajax request, it's also going to start up the session. It's going to make sure that favorites has an initial value. We do that on both pages just to make sure that it exists and we have our stand-in database ready to go. Then I've got a function here, is Ajax request. We talked about that before. It's going to check and see whether requested with is equal to XML HTTP request, so that we know this is from Ajax. Notice the negative there. If it's not an Ajax request, then just exit. It won't do anything. But if it is an Ajax request, then we're going to extract the ID for the blog post that we want to mark. We need to know which one it is. Once we figure out which one it is, then we can store that in session favorites, and we can return true or false. Then this page will receive that event. It'll be in the response text for true or false. If the result is true, then we'll be able to visually indicate that this blog post has been marked. We'll know it succeeded, and the database now has that stored. So that's the setup. Let's take a quick look at it in the browser. So we're going to be inside Firefox. For me, the location is going to be localhost Kevin Skogland. You'll need to adapt that to be whatever your web root is. And then it's going to be Ajax_button. So this is what it looks like. Again, blog post number 1, and it has a favorite button. Blog post number 2, and it has a favorite button. Blog post 103, and it has a favorite button. Now those buttons right now aren't going to actually work correctly. We're going to have to do a little bit of work to make that work out. So don't click them yet. Right now we're just looking at what we've got as a starting point so that we know where we're going to go from here. In the next movie, let's talk about what we need to do in order to send that button's Ajax request, because it's going to work a little bit differently than the way we've done it in the past. In this movie, we'll continue our project by writing the code for sending the Ajax request on our favorite buttons. So in the last movie, we got to look at the starting code. We saw that we have our Ajax button here, favorite, and we want to be able to click that and have it send an Ajax request. And if you remember, back in our code, we bound a different click to each one of those buttons. So we have many buttons. So when we click it, we're going to call favorite. Now favorite needs to know which one was clicked. It needs to know, did I click the first one, the second one, the third one? So we have to have some way of knowing which one of these was clicked. If we go back up here and we look at what a blog post looks like, what we really are after is we want to get a hold of this ID that's right here. Div ID blog post 103. That's what indicates which blog post this is. It's the ID for the outermost div that describes this blog post. So how do we find that? How do we find blog post 103? So we have a favorite button here. The parent of that is this div. It's a child node of the parent. So what we want to do is we want to find this element and then find its parent. Now when we're working with a function that's being called from a click event, we have access to this, and this is a JavaScript term that refers to the current element, the element that we're working with now. So from this, we can call parent element, and that will return the parent element. Let's capture that in a variable. So now the parent is going to be equal to this parent element, and now we have the ability to know what that parent's ID is. So we'll get to sending that ID in a moment. Let's look at the rest of our code here. We're going to create our new XML HTTP request object. So we've got that. We have it as a GET request right now. But if you think about it, we're making a change on the remote server. We're not getting back data like we've been doing in the past. We're actually affecting a change. And so it's most appropriate for us to use post in this case. We're going to post data to that server. Now, whenever we're using post, the very next thing that you ought to think about is the fact that we want to set another request header. I'm going to copy this one, and instead of requested with, it's going to be content type. And the content type we want to set is always going to be application x-www.form.url encoded. It's a very long thing. Make sure you type it correctly. That's going to set the content type so that our form data is sent appropriately as a post request. So first thing, as soon as you do post, the very next step ought to be to set this content type. Okay, there's one more change we need to make, which is that we need to actually send that parent ID in our form data. And the way we do that is by saying as an argument to send. So down here in send, let's add ID equals, and then plus parent ID. That parent node, and just ask for its ID. What's that going to be equal to? It's equal to this whole string, blog-post-103. So that's going to be the form data that we send with our post request. Let's try it out. It's always a good idea to sort of try things in steps and make sure that you haven't made a mistake as you go along. So let's save that page. Notice that when I get the response text back, I'm setting equal to result, and then I'm logging that to the console. So that'll give me the opportunity over here in Firefox, if I bring up my console, right, I should be able to see what's happening. Now let's go to favorite, and when the value comes in here, we want to extract that ID. So I'm going to do that by just first getting the raw ID. That's the ID that we get sent by post. Post ID, if it's set, then set it equal to that value. If not, set it equal to nothing. And that's raw ID. And then I should just be able to echo $raw ID. That will return it as the value. Then I'll be able to at least see it. So let's try it. Let's go back to our page. Ajax button, let's reload the page so we start fresh. And let's click favorite on the first one. There it is, blog post 101. Let's scroll down, let's click the second one. Blog post 102. Scroll down, blog post 103. So it works. We are sending the right value. We were able to successfully find the right value from the parent element, and then we were able to send it to our PHP. Now that we have that working, in the next movie, let's talk about how we can use PHP to process that value, find part of it we want, store it in our session, and send back a response. Now that our favorite buttons can send Ajax requests with the correct information, let's learn how to use PHP to process those requests. In the last movie, we were able to find the raw ID that was being sent in, and we were able to double check that that was correct. Now what we want to do is take that value, and we want to get the numeric portion. It's blog-post-101. We just want the 101 part. Now there's a number of ways that we could pull that off. There are many different ways we could write that in PHP. The one that I'm going to write is one using preg match. This is a little bit more of an advanced way of doing it, but it's very reliable, and so that's why I'm going to stick with it. The idea is that I'm writing a regular expression, and that regular expression is going to look for this pattern inside the ID. So here's my regular expression, and I'm going to use raw ID. And then anything that it finds, it's going to store inside another variable I'm creating called matches. And you'll notice here that there's parentheses around this \d+. What I'm saying is that there will be one or more digits, and the parentheses are telling it to capture those values. And that's going to capture it and put it inside matches. Now it's going to return true only if it finds a match, otherwise it'll return false. That's why I put it in the if statement. Once I do that, then I can say that the ID is equal to matches, and 1 is where the value is going to be stored. It's an array, and in position number 1 of that array is where the ID, that first match, will be. So this is a way of both checking to see if it exists and at the same time capturing that value so that I can use it. So if that's true, then we'll have our ID. We'll do some other processing here. Let me just copy this. We'll store session and favorites, and then we'll return true or false. So I'm going to do that return true or false. If we want to return something, we're not inside a function, remember, we're inside an Ajax response. We're responding back. So we use echo, and I'm going to use the string true. Not true or false, but the actual string true. That's what I'm going to send back as a response to this request. Or false if things did not work out. If for some reason it was not able to match this regular expression. Okay, so I'm going to remove this line here. Now all I need to do is take that ID and store it inside session favorites. So this is just PHP. If it's not in the array, I'm going to use ID, and let me just copy this so I don't have to retype it. Session favorites. So if ID is not in that array, then session favorites, and I'm going to put a set of square brackets after it to say that we should append the ID to the end. That's what it's going to do. It's going to take that value and it's going to put it at the end of the favorite. So the first time that I come here, favorites is going to be an empty array. Notice up here I've initialized it. And then whenever it receives a request with the correct ID in there, it's going to take that ID, locate just the numeric portion as a string, and it's going to take that and put it inside session favorites. And then it should return true back to my index.php page. Let's try it out. Let's save it. Let's reload the page. And let's try clicking favorite here. Result, true. All right, now we don't actually know whether it worked or not though. Supposedly, it will have added it to my session favorites. How could we check that? Well, one easy way is just right here at the very top. Let's put a little bit of code just to cheat. And let's write code that says echo join, and then let's ask for those session favorites. Let me copy it. So it'll take the value that's there. It's an array. It'll take it, it'll join it together, and it'll echo the value right at the top of my page. So let's take a look here. Let's go back to Firefox. Let's just reload our page. And there it is. You can see 101 is stored in my session. Let's try blog post number 2. Okay, blog post number 2 returned true. Now it didn't change here because remember, this is not Ajax. It's not updating this value. But if I reload the page, you'll see that now 101 and 102 are inside there. So it is adding them correctly. That's exactly what I would want it to do. Now, incidentally, if you want to clear out those values, all you have to do is just add a line, just temporarily, that says session favorites equals nothing. And that'll erase it. That just reinitializes it. Let's just reload our page one more time. And sure enough, you'll see that they're gone. Okay, so we can take away those temporary measures. Let's come down here. We now know that this is working. You can comment this out if you think you might want to use it again. I'm going to go ahead and just remove it altogether. We now know that we are correctly processing the favorites, that we're sending in the values, it's finding the right ID, and it's storing it in the session appropriately. Now we're ready to handle the response that's sent back to our original Ajax request. In the previous movie, we were able to capture and store the correct ID in the session. But at the moment, the user doesn't have any indication whether the Ajax request succeeded or not. In this movie, we're going to make that clear. One of the best ways to make it clear that an item has changed is to mark it with a different class in CSS. And it's best if we can do that at the very top level, the parent of the item. In this case, the blog post class. So what we want to do is add a class to this blog post to know that it's a favorite. So it makes sense that the class would be called favorite. We want to do that if we get back a true result. So if the result comes back and it's equal to the string true, not the actual true or false, but the string true, then we want to take that parent that we've been working with. Remember, that's the parent element of this favorite button. We want to take that parent and we want to say that its class list ought to add, and then let's put in favorite. So that's going to add favorite to its class list if we get back true. Let's try it. Let's save it. Let's go back here to Firefox. Let's reload our page. And now let's favorite this item. And we see get back true. Let's look at the inspector that will allow us to actually inspect each of these blog posts. And you'll see that we've added favorite here to the class. Do you see that? Before we just had class blog post. Now the first one has been marked favorite. Let's come down. Let's mark the second one favorite. Boom. See that get added? So it adds the class for us. Now we didn't make any change here. At the moment it just adds the class, but we're set up so that we can make absolutely any changes we want. We can make the border or the background a different color. We can put all sorts of indicators here. The way that I'm going to do it is I want us to add a little icon in the corner to indicate that whether something is a favorite or not. And I want it to look like this. I'm going to put it right at the top. I'm calling it class favorite heart, and I'm using an HTML entity ampersand hearts semicolon. Let's see what that looks like. Let's save it. Let's go back. Let's reload the page. And there it is. It's a little black heart like that. Now we can also add in some styling information for it as well that will make it look a little nicer. Let me just come right here to style. And we're going to make it a red heart, make it a little bigger, and we're going to float it to the right. So it'll be over on the right side of the box. And then I've also got some code here that says that it's going to display none to start with, but if the class favorite is above it, so it's favorite and then favorite heart, then it will display block. Let's go back and let's try that out. Let's come back. Let's reload our page. You'll see that it's not showing there right now. Let's go to blog post 101 and click favorite. And there it is. It appeared. Now I've only got that on one of them right now. I also need to add it to the top of the other two. So blog post 101. Let's add it to the top of blog post 102 and the top of blog post 103. All right, let's go try it. Reload the page. It doesn't show to begin with. We click favorite and it does. Click favorite and it does. We click favorite and it does. Now, we do have another problem here though, which is that it does it correctly when we're responding to the request. But if you'll notice when I reload the page, they go away again. Now it's still stored in the session. It still remembers that we have those favorites stored in our session. The problem is that we don't have anything when the page first loads that looks in the session to figure out whether one of these should be marked with a heart. So let's add that feature in the next movie. In the previous movie, we learned how to handle the Ajax response and to provide a visual indicator in our blog post to let us know when it had been favorited. However, we also realized that there was a problem, and that is that even though I can click the favorite button and it'll put the red heart there for me, if I reload the page, that red heart is lost. And the reason why is because the Ajax response is putting favorite in the class for the blog post. But when the page first loads, there's no code checking to see if something has been favorited when it renders it for the first time. So the Ajax has gotten slightly more advanced than the HTML code. Now let's add some code so that it will always take into account whether or not something has been favorited in the past. Up here at the top of our index.php page, right after we initialize the session, I'm going to write a new function, isFavorite. I'm going to pass in an ID, and it's just going to return true or false depending on whether something is a favorite or not. So how do we do that? Well, it's going to return whether something is in the array. We're going to look for ID inside session favorites. So I'll copy that, paste it right there, and then let's save that. Now we have the ability to find out if something is a favorite or not. Now we can come down here, and on each of our blog posts, we can use that. So after class blog post, I can add a bit of code here, PHP, that will if is favorite, and then what do we want to pass in? It's the ID, 101. So if is favorite 101, then what do we want to do? We want to echo favorite. That's it. Let's copy that same bit of PHP code and let's drop down to our next blog post. Let's do it again. Make sure you put a space so that blog post space and then our PHP code. And same thing here, blog post space and our PHP code. But this is going to be for 103. This one's going to be for 102. Now, probably in the real world, if you were doing this, you wouldn't have 3 separate listings for this. You would programmatically be listing out these blog posts. You'd be pulling them out of the database, and you would just have to have this code one time, and you would dynamically use the ID of each one of these blog posts in this code. So let's save it, and let's try it out. Let's reload our page. Look at that. We got all 3 of our hearts. So now it knows that something has been favorited. Let's try it again, just to make sure we've got it right. I'm going to take session favorites, and let's clear it. So all I have to do is put that in there. Let's reload the page. Now there are no favorites. Take that line back out. Let's reload the page one more time. Okay, so blog post 101, favorite it, there's the heart. When I reload the page, the heart remains. It works exactly as we'd expect. Now that we have our favorite button completely working, in the next movie, let's talk about how we might unfavorite blog posts if we wanted to undo our action. We have a working favorite button using Ajax. The last step is for us to create an unfavorite button so that we can also undo our action. The process is almost identical. I'm going to walk you through it, but if you think you have a good grasp on the previous code, then I would encourage you to pause the movie and attempt it on your own first. Then you can watch me if you get stuck. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to switch over to our index.php page, and we want to duplicate the button that we had. So here's our favorite button. I'm going to just copy that. I'm going to put another button right below it. It's going to be called unfavorite button. Unfavorite. And I'm going to copy that button, and let's put it down here below these 2 as well. And then we want to make sure that the CSS applies as well. You see that I have button favorite button up here. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to make it also apply to the unfavorite button. And button favorite hover will also need to apply to button unfavorite hover. Okay, so let's jump down to the bottom then. We have our JavaScript here for favorite. I'm just going to collapse that so it folds up. And then where we assign that function as an event listener on the click. So I'm going to take all of that code, I'm going to copy it, and I'm just going to paste it a second time, but this time, of course, I'm going to change this one to be unfavorite. And down here, it's going to be unfavorite, and we're going to put it on the unfavorite button. Okay, so now I have my new JavaScript. We need to go through and review this JavaScript. We want it to post not to favorite.php, but to unfavorite.php. And then instead, we get back true from it, Instead of adding favorite to the class, we want to remove favorite from the class. Everything else works pretty much the same. We're still sending the ID in the exact same way. We're just going to be sending it to a different script and performing a different result when we get that result back. Okay, so let's save all of that. Now we don't have unfavorite.php, so we need to create that. The easiest way to do that is just to duplicate favorite.php. So I'm going to go over here to this file. From the file menu, I will choose duplicate. It duplicates the file. Let's rename it to unfavorite. All right, so now we've got our file. Let's come back over here. Let's open it up. And let's see what we need to change. The initialization is all the same at the beginning. We're going to find the ID in the same way. But I want to remove the not in front of in array because we want to check and see if it is in the array, then we're going to remove it. Otherwise, we don't need to do anything. So what needs to change here is instead of adding the ID to the session, we need to remove the ID from the session. There are a few different ways that we could do that. I'm going to do it by writing a new function that will do it. So it's going to be session favorites equal to array remove ID and then pass in session favorites. So this is going to be a function I'm going to write. It's a handy function to have that will remove ID from this array. I'm going to call it array remove. So I've got to define that function. Let's jump up here to the top, and right above is Ajax request. I'll put a handy function to remove a single element from an array. Now I could type all of that in, but I'm just going to paste some code so that you can just take a look at what I've got, the result. So array remove takes an element, takes an array, it uses array search to find out the position, the index of that element in the array, and then it uses array splice. Array splice allows me to take an array, to go to that index, and to remove one item. That's what the one means. So it's going to remove one item and splice the result onto the end. So it's like taking the first part, skipping one, taking the second part, and taking those two parts and putting them back together, splicing them together. And it returns the array as a result. This is a very handy function to have in your PHP library. So now we'll save it and let's try it out. Let's see if we've got everything working. So I'll go into Firefox. Let's reload our page so that we get all of our new JavaScript code. You can see we also get our unfavorite button. Let's click favorite first. Okay, so now it's favorited. Let's reload our page just to make sure that's stuck. It sure did. Now let's click unfavorite, and there it disappeared. Let's reload the page to make sure, yes, it is in fact gone from our session. So now we can favorite things and we can unfavorite them. Now this is all right, but it's a little clunky to have both favorite and unfavorite as buttons sitting here all the time. After all, when it's already favorited, we don't really want to have a favorite button visible anymore. So let's go back to our index.php page. Let's jump up to the CSS at the top. Let's use a little CSS trick to make this a little bit nicer. So right here, after I have the hover statement, I'm going to add another one here, which is button favorite button. And we're going to say that by default, it ought to be display inline. That means that it will display. But if it's been favorited, then we don't want it to display. So I'll copy that, and we'll say if it has been favorited, and we have the class favorite around it, then we want to display none. And let's do the same thing. We're just going to copy those. We'll paste them for the unfavorite button. But for the unfavorite button, by default, we want it to display none, but only when the class favorite is there should it display inline. Let's go back and you'll see how this trick works. Let's reload the page. You can see that unfavorite is here by default for that one. This one has favorite here by default, right? When I click unfavorite, now it switches to say favorite, unfavorite. It's actually two different buttons, but you can see that it swaps them out using the CSS, just like we did with the heart, so that we're actually getting two different buttons each time. Now we have both the ability to favorite a blog post and to unfavorite it, and we did it using Ajax. As a final step, I just want to show you that if you go to favorite.php and you uncomment this line here that says you can simulate a slow server with sleep, I just want to remove that. This is going to sleep for 2 seconds before it tries to execute the script. And it's a useful way to see what it's like. Let me just unfavorite this. Now when I click favorite, it's going to take a 2-second pause. But during that 2 seconds, notice that I can keep moving and the heart just appears when it's ready. That was our overall goal, to maintain interactivity on the page while this process happens in the background. In this chapter, we will build a form which uses Ajax to send its data to a remote server asynchronously. The form that we're going to create is going to submit the length, width, and height to the server, and then get back the total volume as a response. Now, I'm very well aware that we could just use plain old client-side JavaScript to perform this task. After all, it's just math, where multiply length times width times height, and JavaScript is perfectly capable of doing that without using Ajax to send a request to a remote server. But what I wanted to do was create a really simple form that can serve as a stand-in for any kind of form that might submit its request asynchronously. For example, you might create a user login form that submits the username and the password in order to log in a user. Or you might have a contact us or a feedback form where we just want to pop up a feedback form in an overlay and allow the user to type in their feedback and hit submit and have it submit asynchronously without ever leaving the page that they were on. Or you might want to have a poll or a survey that either pops up in a window or shows on the side of a page. This is also the way that Facebook posts work when you post something to Facebook or when you use Twitter to tweet. These are all asynchronously submitted forms. You can also use it for a dictionary or a phrase translator. That's a more complex operation that plain old JavaScript on the client side probably isn't capable of. But a server would have more complex software, a larger dictionary or library of phrases, and could give you a result. It also could be used for uploading files or for performing in-place content editing. That is, we click on a bit of content and we get an editing form right there so that we can edit the content without ever leaving the page that we're on. So throughout this example, keep that in mind. While our example is very simple, it's a stand-in for more complex kinds of forms that you might want to create. And it'll still give us the opportunity to examine some important features. As a starting point, I've already got some files in my sites directory in the folder Ajax_form. These are in the exercise files if you have access to those. If not, you can certainly create them so that you can work along with me. It's very similar to the work we've been doing in the past chapters. Let's look at index.php first. It's a basic HTML page. You can see that it has a form here. Everything from form to form is the form. Above it is some text that says enter measurements below to determine the total volume. The form has an ID of measurement form. Its action is going to be process_measurements.php, and the method is post. This is what a normal HTML form would look like. It has the form tag, it has action, and it has a method, which is going to be post. Then we've got several form fields. These are inputs of type text. That's a text input field. We've got one for length, one for width, and one for height, and each one of those is labeled out here to the side. And then I've got two submit buttons, and I wanted to have two of them partly so you could see the difference between them. The first one is what a basic HTML submit button would look like, and its type is submit. Now I've got an Ajax submit button right below it. Notice that its type is not submit. It's always better not to do it as a submit button when you're using Ajax. You want to just use a plain old button. A submit button has a few extra behaviors built into it that we're not going to want. And then you can see I've got a section down here with ID of result. It says the total volume is, and then in span tags, I've got a place for the volume. And I've given it an ID just to make it easy for me to target it with my JavaScript and put a value right inside of here. Notice also that result is not visible from the start. It's set as display none. So I'll have to make it visible when I finally have a result. Now if we look at the JavaScript code, this is all the kinds of things that we've seen before. Let's jump down first of all to our calculate measurements code. The calculate measurements code is going to call clear result, so we clear any previous results that we had. If we go up here and we look at that, it just simply takes that volume, which we've already figured out the element that is, get element by ID volume. It takes that volume and sets its inner HTML to be nothing, and it tells the result div that it should hide itself again. Now, when we actually have results, we're going to post those results in that same volume inner HTML, and we're going to say that the result should be display block, and that will make it visible. So I've got two functions that just make that easy, post result and clear result. I like to write things in functions like this so that it keeps this code a lot leaner. Next, you can see inside calculate measurements that I'm finding the form. I'm finding it by its ID, measurement form. So here it is, form. Now, I'm going to need to determine the form action. The action is what I want to submit to right here. Now, I certainly could just retype it. I could go up here and I could copy this process measurements.php and I could plug that down into my Ajax. There's actually a little nicer way that we can do it. We can type var action equals, we can say the form to get attribute of action, just like that. So now whatever the forms action was is what JavaScript is going to know is the action, and we can use it in our Ajax as well. That's nice. So if I make a change up here to this, and suddenly it's called send measurements, now it changes in my Ajax as well, right? They're linked together. So that's nice. All right, let's drop back down here. Look at the rest of it. Remember, if we're using a post request, which we want to do because we're going to be submitting data, then in that case, we want to be sure that we set the request header for the content type to be application/x-www-form-URL encoded. Always do that whenever you're using post and you're submitting form data. I'm also setting another request header to let it know that it is an Ajax request. And then I've got my onReadyState change function that we've seen a couple of times now. So when the ready state is ready, then we'll take the response text and I'm going to post that result. Whatever I get back, I'm going to call post result, which you'll remember just drops it right into the page and makes it the result visible. Now notice here that I've also got send form data. We'll come back and talk about that a little later. So just remember that we need to also gather the form data. We determine the form action. I could take that line out, but we're going to have to come back and gather our form data. And then last of all, you can see that I've got get element by ID on that Ajax submit button, and I've told it when it's clicked that it should call the calculate measurements function. So all that should be pretty familiar to you. Let's take a quick look at process measurements.php. It's a very simple page. We have a function to see if it's an Ajax request or not, and then I'm just simply getting those values that have been sent in as post variables for length, for width, and for height, and I'm making sure that those are integers, not strings. I'm typecasting them as being integers, and then I multiply them together to get the volume, and then if it's an Ajax request, then I just echo back volume. If it's not an Ajax request, then we'll just exit the script. Okay, so now that we have the basics in place, in the next movie, let's talk about how we go about gathering our form data. There are several ways to gather the form data that we want to send in our Ajax request, and there are pros and cons to each one that we might choose. First, we could just simply use JavaScript to go and find the attributes that we want one at a time. We go and locate them, we get their value, we put it together in a string. That's certainly a very reliable way to do it, and that's a good way to do it with very small forms, but it becomes very tedious if we have to work with lots and lots of attributes, right? We would have to keep going back over and over. So a better way would be to try and write a bit of code that we could reuse, a bit of code that we could just say, go get all of the form attributes and return all those attributes to me assembled and ready to go so that we can pass them to our Ajax request. So we might try to write some custom code of our own that would loop through a form looking for all of its elements and gathering up all of those attributes with their values so that we could submit them. And that's a perfectly valid way to go. There's also another possibility, which is that because this is a common need, there's a lot of third-party libraries that perform this task for us. You could certainly search on the internet for the ability to serialize a form. That's the term that's used for gathering up all those attributes. And jQuery actually includes serialize in the jQuery library. So if you're using jQuery, that's already built in for you. And then the fourth possibility is that there's a special class called form data. And it's a class that was added to Ajax or to the XML HTTP request specification as round 2. We call that XHR2 for short. And it kind of went together with HTML5. So browsers that support HTML5 and XHR2 will have the form data class available. And this makes the process very easy. We'll see how that works in a moment. Most modern browsers support form data. It was added over 5 years ago. However, it does not work with Internet Explorer 8 or Internet Explorer 9. So if you need to still support older browsers like that, then that won't be an option for you. You'll have to pick one of the other options. So that option only works if we don't need to support IE 9 or earlier, if we're really focused on just modern browsers. Then we can use the form data class. Let's look at options number 2 and number 4 in a bit more detail. So to gather our form data here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have var form data equals to, and I'm going to write a custom function called gather form data. All right, the idea is that it's going to take a form as an argument, and then it's going to loop through that form looking for all of those inputs that we've got. So up here above calculate measurements, I'm just going to paste in a function that we can then take a look at. Gather form data, we pass in a form, it takes the form, it gets elements by their tag name, looking for input. It takes all of those inputs then and loops through them one at a time using a for loop. And for each one, it takes the name, the value, and puts an equal sign between them. And it puts those all into an array. I've just called it array. And after it puts them all into the array, then at the end, we join the array together using an ampersand. And that's what we return. That would give us exactly the kind of string that we're looking for. Let's try it out. Let's save our page. Let's open up our page. Ajax form is what we want to go to. Here's what our form looks like. We've got length, width, and height. I've got my HTML submit button and my Ajax submit button. So let's hit 2 times 2 times 2. So the volume of 2 times 2 times 2 ought to be 8. That's what I expect to get back. So I'm going to click Ajax submit. There we get the total volume is 8. And the console tells me the result that came back was 8 as well. So that's correct. Let's try another one. Let's try 3 and let's try 4 and 5. And we get back 60. That's the total volume. So that works, and that's a perfectly valid approach. But notice that I have a comment up here that mentions that this only works with input fields. It omits text areas, select options, checkboxes, and radio buttons. It only looks for this type of tag. And our form might have lots of different things. Now we could write a more advanced version of this. Those are certainly out there on the internet. You can browse them or you could write your own. And we could go through and we could look for those other types of things. Instead of looking by tag name, we could go through all of the form's elements and loop through its elements and add up all the values that way. And that would work. But at that point, you might be better off looking at some third-party libraries, things that have all that complexity already built into them. Instead, I'm going to leave gather form data here for now, but I'm going to come down here now and we're going to try the other approach that we talked about before, and that's the form data class. The way that we use it is we just call new form data. It's a new JavaScript object, just like we called new XML HTTP request. We call new form data, and we pass it our form, and guess what it does? It goes through and it loops through all the elements, gathers up all those different elements, gets them ready for us to send. Before we try it, I just want to add an extra bit of code here that's just going to loop through the form data entries, and for each one it'll just log its key and its value so we can see what those look like. So let's save this. We're no longer calling our gather form data function. Instead, we're going to create a new form data object and pass it in our form so that it can do all of that for us. Let's save our page. Let's reload the page so we get new JavaScript, and let's try 2, 2, and 2. Ajax submit. Okay, we got back length 2, width 2, and height 2. You see those values, those entries there? But wait a minute, our total volume is 0. What happened here? So here's the thing about form data that you have to be very careful about, which is that form data is a fairly advanced way of dealing with form data, and it allows us to attach files as well. That's something that's a little bit trickier to do because we can't use XWWW form encoded as the content type when we have files. So whenever we're gathering our own attributes, we do want to set the request header to form URL encoded. But if we're using form data, we want to comment that out. Do not set content type with form data. All right, it's going to set things up the way that it needs them to be set up. So just leave that out and let's go back and try it again. We'll reload the page. Let's try 2, 2, and 2. Ajax submit. The volume is now 8. Now it was able to correctly encode those values and send them to PHP so PHP could work with them. So certainly the easiest way to work with form data is with this form data object. Unfortunately, it's not supported by IE9 or earlier, in which case you would either want to write your custom code or go looking for third-party libraries that can make that happen for you. In the previous movie, we were able to gather the form data, submit it via Ajax, and display the result. You might think our project is done, but before we declare it a total success, there are a few other aspects we should consider. There are 3 items related to the UX, or user experience, which we should always consider when submitting forms via Ajax. The first is that we're going to need to consider how we want to handle form errors. Frequently, when we're submitting form data to the server, there's the possibility that something on the form is wrong, that some of the data is invalid, and it needs to be fixed before the process could continue. We need to consider how we're going to handle reporting those form errors to the user so that they can fix them and resubmit the data. The second is that we should indicate the loading status. Especially when we're sending form data, it may take the server a little while to respond, and we don't want the user to just think that our form is broken while it's waiting. And we also want to disable the submit button. This will prevent the user from submitting the data a second time accidentally. Let's start by looking at how we can handle form errors. It is possible for us to handle many of the errors on our form in the page using just JavaScript, the JavaScript that's already on the page, not Ajax. It's especially easy to spot problems like leaving one of these fields blank. But often, it's more robust to let the server validate the data and return any errors that keep it from providing a response. It could detect fields which have been left blank, but in other cases, it might go and check the database to see if the form data matches the expected stored information in the database. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add code to our processmeasurements.php page that's on our server side that will detect these errors. I'm going to start by first adding up the errors on the server side. So let's look for errors, and I'm going to store those errors inside a new array. So for the first one, I'll say if, and the error I'm going to detect for is the fact that we've left length blank. If there is no value sent for the length, then we know that it's going to be set to an empty string. So let's just set if length is equal to an empty string, then what do we want to do? We want to add an error to our errors array. And we'll just make our error length. We're just going to record the fact that there was an error on the length text input. Now, a fancier version of this could also include the reason for the error. Maybe there's many different reasons that the length could be invalid, and we want to keep track of what those are. But we're going to keep it simple from now and just keep track of the fact that there was an error there. I'm going to add two more here. This one is going to be for width, and this one will be for height. So of course these need to be width and also height. Okay, so now I should come out of this with an array telling me which ones of these different inputs had errors. Next, I need to return those errors as the result of my Ajax query. So before we even calculate the volume, let's check and see if that is empty or not. So if errors is not empty, then let's echo back and then double quote, and then let's have curly braces because we're going to return JSON. We're going to make the key to our JSON errors, and then let's have another double quote here, and let's do JSON encode our errors array. Now, based on everything we've talked about so far, that should do the job, and we should just be able to exit at the end and return back the errors as JSON. Now, there's a subtle problem here, and I want to just mention it to you so we can fix it right away, which is that I've put errors here in single quotes. And JSON is actually picky about whether or not you use single quotes or double quotes. PHP isn't picky about it, JavaScript isn't picky about it, but the JSON parser is picky about it. So we need to either make sure we use double quotes here, or let's just put a note here, won't work because of single quotes. Let's just move that. And the better way to do it is to instead come up with a result array, which is going to be in PHP exactly the array we want. Then we can just write PHP code for it. And let's make it errors. All right, so that's the JSON that we want. And now we can just JSON encode the whole thing. And JSON encode will make sure that it is properly formatted for us. So that will give us something that's good. It'll make sure that it always handles the single quote, double quote issue appropriately for us. We don't have to think about it. So just keep that in mind. It's always better if we can just JSON encode the whole thing. Develop the array and all the content that you want as one single PHP structure, and then call JSON encode on it to turn it into JSON. Now if we're going to return JSON in the case when we have errors, then it's probably a better practice to also return JSON for all responses, not just the ones with errors. So right here where we're returning volume, we probably should also return volume here. Now, we could build our own JSON array here, but we know that it's better to use that JSON encode. So let's do that, JSON encode, and then let's create a new array. Let me just erase some of these closing quotes, and it's going to be volume. That's the key. The value will be the volume, and then we have double parentheses to close it. See how that works? So now we're returning JSON in both cases. We're returning JSON for our errors, and we're returning JSON in our success case, looking for volume. That'll allow us to parse the result as JSON in both cases. As soon as we get back a result, we can turn it into JSON and then start inspecting the results from there. Okay, so let's save that file. Now that we're returning back our errors as JSON, let's come back over here to our result, and instead of getting back post result, let's first go and get our JSON. So var JSON equals JSON parse result. And now if JSON, we're going to use has own property errors. Has own property errors. And that'll tell us if that key is available and if the JSON errors length is greater than 0. So is the key present? And if we look at the errors themselves, is there actually one or more errors there? You can also use has, but it's not as well supported by older browsers. So has own property is a slightly more compatible version. So I'm going to stick with that. So if we have errors, then we're going to call a new function called display errors, where we'll take care of what we're going to do there. We'll pass it in all those errors. Now, if we don't have errors, then we want to post our result, just like we did before, but it's not the result anymore. Now it's JSON volume, right? That's where we're going to find that value. So we'll still pass it to the same function that we had before, and it'll still work. So now we need to write that display errors function. So I'm going to scroll up here, and right before we post the result, I'm going to add a new function called display errors. It's going to find all of those tags, the inputs, so we have each one of them, and then it's going to loop through them. It's going to go through each one of those inputs, and each one it's going to assign to input, right? Inputs with I, so it's going to be 0, then 1, then 2, and 3, and then I'm going to call errors index of the name. What that's going to do is it's going to look at the errors and see, is this name, this current input name, isn't present in that array. I'm using index of to do that. Index of returns either the index, where it's found in the array, or -1 if it's not present. Again, we could use has, but that's not as well supported by older browsers like Internet Explorer 8 and 9. So I'm going to stick with index of. So if the index of is greater than or equal to 0, we know it found a match, and in that case, we're going to add to its class list error, and that will make it then marked as an error. So then we just need to handle writing some CSS. Let's scroll up to our top, and let's add just a little bit of CSS here that says that if something has the class of error, that it's going to have a border 1 pixel solid red around it. So let's go back and let's try it all out. Let's reload our page. Okay, so now let's just try submitting it with no data at all. Let's click Ajax Submit. Look at that, we got 3 red boxes. And it tells us down here in our result, it gives us the JSON it got back, errors, length, width, and height. Let's try putting something in the length field. Ajax Submit, width and height, right? We got width and height back as errors, but notice it didn't clear the old class. We don't have anything right now that clears those errors. So let's just write a quick function that will do that. Function clear errors. And this will just clear it right at the start. Let's get those inputs again. Let's get all of our inputs, and let's borrow our loop again as well. So we're going to loop through all of them. But for each one, let's just say inputs.i. There we go. For each one, inputs I, class list, remove error. Right? See how that works? It's going to loop through them. It's going to take each one of those inputs and it's just going to remove the error. So now we just need to call clear error. Let's do it right here after clear result. Clear errors. So I'll do it right at the start. As soon as we submit the form, that's the very next thing it'll do. So let's try reloading our page. Let's try Ajax Submit. We got them all there. Now let's try filling this one out. Ajax Submit. All right, no problem there anymore. No problem there. Voila, we finally get a result. See how that works? And anytime we put something else there, it comes back and tells us that we've got an error and marks it as red. Now there are a lot of different ways that you could actually handle errors. You could list the errors. You could have something at the top of the page that says there were problems with the following fields. Or maybe you want to put some text out here next to it saying there's a problem with this field. Or you want to highlight the whole thing in red or make it bold. There are lots of different styles for the way that a user can experience the errors. The important thing is that you consider the errors and make sure that they are handled when you submit a request via Ajax. Otherwise, The user is just looking at a form and has no idea what went wrong. In this movie, we'll look at the second user experience item, which can improve our Ajax form submissions. We will add a loading spinner to indicate when the request is in progress. We did something similar earlier when we just used text, and we used text that just said loading while the request was in process. Now we're going to do it with a graphic. And there's 3 steps to this process. The first is that you add the spinner to your HTML page. The second is that we use CSS to hide the spinner by default. And the third is to write JavaScript, which will control showing and hiding the spinner element. Even though you may not know it by the name loading spinner, I'm sure you've seen this on websites before. A spinner is something like this. It's an animated GIF that just rotates around and around and around. It's just in a loop continuously, and so it looks like something is loading. And the process is that we actually just display this while something's loading, and then we hide it again when it's not. And that's how it works. It's that simple. Let me close that up, and let's go to our desktop. You can see that I already have a spinner file right here. This is included in the exercise files if you need it. You can also go out on the internet, and there are many of these out there, or if you have skills developing animated GIFs, you can do this yourself. I'm going to take this file and drag it into my Ajax form so that now it's available inside my project. So again, the first step that we saw was to add it to our template. So let's just go up here, and right above the result, let's just add in a bit of HTML, which is going to load our spinner. There we are. I've just got it as an image. The source is going to be spinner.gif. The width I've set is 50 and the height is 50. There are a lot of different ways you could put this on the page. You could do it as a background using CSS, many different ways to do it. This is the simplest. You can see that I've got it inside a div with ID spinner. So I'm just going to show and hide this div whenever we want it to disappear. And remember that step 2 was we want it to be hidden by default. So I'm just going to say that the spinner ID ought to be display none. So now it's not going to show. All right, let's just comment that line out for a second, just so that we can see what it looks like. This is how we do comments in CSS. Let's go back and bring up our page, and let's just reload the page, and you'll see there it is. The spinner just runs all the time. It's on the page. Now if we hide it by default, we reload the page. Now it's not there. Well, it's actually there. It's just got display none set on it, so it doesn't appear for us. So now we need to write JavaScript, which is going to control whether or not that spinner shows. So let's scroll down here to our JavaScript, and we've got display errors. Let's do it right before that. Let's write a function. We'll call it show spinner. And the first thing we need to do is find the element by its ID. I'm just going to copy this line here to save me some typing. I'm looking for the spinner, and I'm going to assign it to spinner. And then all I have to do is say, well, the spinner style display should be set to block. And that'll tell it that it should display. So now it won't be display none, it'll be display block. And if we want to hide it again, let's write a function that'll make that easy for us. We'll call that hide spinner. So once again, it finds that spinner, but this time it's display none. So now let's use that JavaScript. So where do we want to show and hide it? Let's come down here. When calculate measurements is called, is when we want to show the spinner. So we want to clear the old result, we want to clear out any errors, and the very next thing we want to do is show that spinner. Let's start it spinning. And then we'll execute our Ajax request. Now I could put this show spinner into my status change down here. That's where we were showing loading before on ready state change. But I'm going to actually do it outside my Ajax request. I'm going to do it before the Ajax even gets started. Start the process that things are spinning, and then let's come down here once we get back our result. So as soon as we have a result, then let's hide that spinner, and then we'll parse the result and display it. So hide spinner. We now have a result back, and we don't need to keep spinning. Let's save it. Let's go back and try it out. Let's reload our page. Let's try putting in a couple of values here. Ajax submit. Now it came back very fast. We very briefly saw that spinner. One way we can simulate a slow server is just to add sleep at the top of our PHP file. That'll mean that the PHP page will pause for 2 seconds before it does anything, before it answers. So let's try it. Let's submit again. Ajax submit. Spin, spin, spin for 2 seconds, and now we get back our result. I think this is a much better user interface. I think that a user now submits this, they get a pause, and then it comes back and it tells them what's wrong on the form. Then they have the ability to fix that, they can submit it again, and now they get back a result. Now, hopefully we aren't going to have to wait 2 seconds for a result. That's a long time for a web server to spend responding, but you get the idea. However long it does happen to take, whether it's a half a second, 1 second, 1.5 seconds, we're going to get that spinner in the meantime so that the user knows to just sit tight that we're doing something. It's a small thing, but it's an important part of the user experience. In this movie, we'll look at a third user experience improvement that we should always consider when submitting forms via Ajax. That is, we will disable the form button so that the form can't be submitted more than once. The process for disabling the button and then re-enabling it later is going to be similar to what we had for show spinner. As soon as calculate measurements is called, before the Ajax request is even sent, we're going to make that button be disabled, and then once we get down here and we have a success on ready state change equals to 4, then we want to re-enable it, just like we are hiding the spinner again. And that will allow the user to then submit the form again. So we're only disabling it for the length of time it takes to get a request back. So let's write our code right here to disable the button. Now we've already found the button down here at the bottom of our page. You'll remember we added an event listener for it down here. So I'm going to copy that, bring that line up here, and that will find the button for us. And then all we have to do in JavaScript is say button.disabled, has to have the D, not disable, but disabled equals true. And that's all it is. Now we'll set disabled equal to true. Let's try it. Save our page, go into Firefox, we've got to reload it so we get our new JavaScript. Let's put in some values, click Ajax submit, and look at that. It's grayed out now. It has in fact been disabled. We can actually click on the inspector here in Firefox, and it will let us look and we can see disabled has been added to Ajax submit. That indicates that this is disabled. Now we want to be able to re-enable it as well. And before we do that, I'm a big fan of taking this kind of code and putting it into a labeled function. So I'm going to cut this, I'm going to create a new function here called disable submit button, and that's what we're going to call whenever we want to disable it. So let's come up here, put it right after the spinners function, disable submit button. We'll paste our code in the middle of that, and that will take care of disabling it. So we want to also re-enable it. Then of course it makes sense. We would just take the same code, and instead of disabled true, it's going to be disabled false. Now this is going to work, but you notice that we're finding the element ID over and over and over again. We actually can put that in the global JavaScript scope up here so that it's already found for us. So then the button has already been found. Let's take this out here, and also down at the very bottom of the page, you can see I'm finding it again here. I've already found button, so I don't need to find it again. So now I've got disable submit button. This one needs to be enable submit button. Right? So disable and enable. So now let's call enable after the whole thing is done. Let's scroll down here, right below hide spinner, enable the submit button again. Okay, so let's save it and let's go try it out. Go back to Firefox, reload our page from scratch so we get all our changes. Ajax submit, came back right away. We can simulate that slow server by coming over here and making sleep for 2 seconds. Now let's go back, submit it again. We get a pause, it's disabled. Yeah, I can't click it until it comes back. You can try it, but it won't submit a second time until we get it back. So it's successfully done its job. Now there's one other thing that I want to show you as well, which is, let's come to index.php, and let's go up here to the disable submit button again. One other thing that some developers like to do is they like to change the text that's on that button at the same time. I don't prefer to do that. I usually just disable it and show the spinner, but I just want to show you how to do it if you wanted to. Value equals loading ... and that will change it to say loading, right? And we can make it change back button.value equals Ajax button. Let's go and save it. Let's come back over here, reload our page, 2, 2, and 2, Ajax submit, loading, Ajax button. Now wait a minute, hold on. Let's go back. This said Ajax submit, and now it says Ajax button. Now I did that on purpose. I made the mistake of mislabeling it, but I wanted to show you that it's easy for these values to get out of sync because we're setting the value in 2 places. We're setting it in the HTML, and then we're setting it again in the Ajax. It'd be much better if we could set that value to be the same thing as whatever it was. just basically put back the old value. All we have to do that is to store that value. Orig button value equals button value, right? So we're storing that in the original button value. So now what is our value? We just need to restore it to orig button value. All right, so let's save it and let's try it out. Let's go back, let's reload our page, and let's put in 2 and 2 and 2, Ajax submit. Oops, we had a problem. Orig button value is not defined. That's because the scope of this variable is only inside this function. We need to have original button value declared before we get inside this function, right? So we're just going to store it out here so that the original button value is determined ahead of time. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and cut it and move it up here. So original button value just gets figured out right at the start. As soon as the page loads, we'll know what its value is, we'll have it stored, and we can always go back to it whenever we want. All right, so now let's try it again. We'll go back, reload the page. We'll put in 3, 3, 3 this time because I've been putting in a lot of 2s. Pause. There it is. And we come back with that original button value again because we had it stored. So it was still on hand for us to be able to display. Changing the text on the button is really optional. The important thing is that we disable that button so that the user can't submit a second request in the background while the first request is still processing. We want to block any additional requests until the first result is returned. There's one more topic I want us to consider about our Ajax forms design. It works great if the user has JavaScript enabled. But what if the user has disabled their JavaScript? What if they're clicking the submit button to submit a plain old HTML form? In that case, we need to ask ourselves, can we give non-JavaScript users a decent experience on our site as well? We should always consider this whenever we're putting any kind of JavaScript features in, whether they're Ajax features or not. And the answer really depends on the context. Sometimes it's going to be possible to have fallbacks to HTML, and sometimes it may not. This is really part of a larger topic called progressive enhancement. The idea is to make your website functional for everyone, but then browsers which have more capabilities are given additional features or enhancements. But the site still works for the lowest common denominator. The idea is to make those special site features all degrade gracefully into something that's still workable for most users, so that every user gets something which works. Let's see how we can alter our code to provide a fallback for HTML. So in our current form that we have, you can see that I have another button here. We've been clicking the Ajax submit button. This submit button, though, submits the form just as a regular HTML request. Let's take a look here. You can see that it is a submit button, so it's type submit, where our other one is type button. So this is just a plain old form submission button. Let's go back and let's click on that button just to see what happens. We click submit and we get our process measurements page and we get nothing back. Why is that? Well, if you'll remember, right now we have code that says check to see if this is an Ajax request, and if it's not, then just exit. But how hard would it be for us to add a little code here that said if it's not an Ajax request, then let's display the volume? We were able to calculate the volume, right? We were still able to get those values. Those were still submitted as post values to this page. So why not just go ahead and display them? So let's add that. Let's put a bit of code here. Instead of exiting, we're going to echo, and let's put quotes inside p tags. We'll use some HTML. The total volume is, now probably really and truly you'd want to have a larger HTML page here. We'd want to put this inside a template so that we could render a full proper HTML page. I'm just going to render back an HTML fragment right now just because it's a little quicker. And then let's also copy that. Let's put another line here inside p tags again. And this one's going to have a link that goes back. ahref equals, and let's put some escape double quotes in here. And this is going to be back, and inside it'll just be index.php. So now we'll also have a link that goes back. So let's try it. Let's see if just that one little change made a difference. Let's go back. Let's click the back button to get back to our page. Here we are on our form. We've got some values. Let's click submit. Look at that. The total volume is 27. We've got a back button to take us back to our page. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but it does give some experience. For users who don't have JavaScript enabled for some reason, they can still submit this page as a regular HTML page and get a result back. Notice though we've also got errors. What happens when something goes wrong on the form? We should probably make a change that'll handle that as well. So let's take this if Ajax request line here, and let's just put it right up here. If we have errors, if it is an Ajax request, then we know we want to do all of this. But if not, else, it's not an Ajax request, what do we want to do in that case? Let's grab this code that's right here because we're going to also want that backlink again. But instead of saying the total volume is, let's say there were errors on space, and then let's take our errors here, but let's implode, and we'll put a comma between them on errors. And implode will join those together with a comma between them so that we'll get a list of our errors, and then we'll have our back. And then we also want to make sure, once again, that we call exit. Actually, I'm going to move exit down here so I can take it out of there. So in either case, if there were errors, it will exit at the end. All right, let's try that. Let's go back. We've got our length. Let's put in 2 and 3, and let's click submit. There were errors on height. Click back. Now we have the ability to go back and do it again. Now it's not perfect. We could obviously think of a lot of improvements. As I said, we could write a full HTML page with a header and a footer and everything like that. We also could put the query parameters here, right? So that when you clicked on the back button, it would pre-populate those fields with the length, the width, and the height, instead of taking us back to a blank form. But those are all minor points that you could do on your own. The main point is that we're providing an experience for users, even if they're not submitting a JavaScript or an Ajax request to the page. Now, at the moment, you have the ability to try both. You have the ability to submit using HTML or to submit using Ajax. And this is great to be able to try it out. But in the real world, we probably wouldn't want to have 2 buttons there. We'd want to have one button that handles both cases and that gracefully degraded, so that we have this idea of progressive enhancement. And users who have JavaScript would get the Ajax experience, and users who didn't would get the HTML experience. In order to do that, we need to talk about the idea of prevent default, which we'll do in the next movie. In this movie, we'll learn how to use JavaScript to prevent default behavior from executing. Specifically, we're going to learn how we can bind our Ajax function to a submit button, but also prevent that submit button from submitting a non-Ajax request. Let me start by demonstrating the issue that we have. So in our existing Ajax form, we have 2 buttons, one that submits a regular HTML form and one that submits an Ajax request. And that's useful for being able to see both of them and to try them both out. But in the real world, we wouldn't want to have that. We would want to just have one single button. And we'd want that button to function as an HTML button if the user didn't have JavaScript enabled, and we would want it to function as an Ajax button if they did. That's the idea of progressive enhancement. So let's go over here and let's just try that real quick. Let's try and make one button. Notice that the submit button has a type of submit, and the Ajax button was just a regular button. Only the type submit is going to submit the form for the HTML version. So we have to keep that one. The Ajax one is the one we want to get rid of. So now we want to bind our Ajax events to this button instead, HTML submit. So I'm going to copy that, and let's just scroll down here to where our code is looking for getElementById Ajax submit. And let's change that to now be HTML submit. Okay, so that's going to find our new button and set it equal to that value. So we're good on every other front, right? We've gone ahead and we've bound that value there. If we scroll down to the bottom, you can see that we've got this click event, add listener, click. It's going to call calculate measurements. So let's save all this and let's try it out and just see what happens. Let's reload our page. We have one button now. Let's put in some values, 2, 3, and 4. We'll click submit. And you may have noticed that it very quickly gave us the spinner, but then we came over to the new page. We got the effect of the HTML submission, not our Ajax. If we click back, let's click this back button here to go back, you'll see that this is actually disabled. So it did do some of our Ajax code, but in the end, 2, 3, 4, you saw it say loading for a second, and then here we are on our HTML page. And the reason why is because that submit button will still fire its default action, which is to send the HTML form. So we're actually getting 2 requests. We're getting Ajax firing off its request, but before it can get a response back, the browser has already submitted the form as a regular HTML form, and we've switched to our new page. That's not what we want. So if you come down here to our add event listener, there are a couple of things that you need to know to make this work. The first is that we're binding this function, calculate measurements, onto the click. This is actually the same thing as if we had an anonymous function here, which called calculate measurements. I'll put this on the same line here, but notice that I've got this curly brace here. Just don't miss that. That's an easy mistake to make. So I've got a function, I've got a curly brace, and inside there I've got calculate measurements, and I'm just calling that function. So those are the same thing. It would work exactly the same way. The second thing you need to know is that there's actually a value for the event, for the click that gets passed in to this anonymous function. And if we provide an argument to the function, then we can capture that event. So here, function event, now we have the ability to work with that event. And so all we need to do is say event.prevent capital D default. That's it. So what we're saying is add an event listener on the click. So we're going to do something when it's clicked, and then we're going to tell that click to prevent whatever its default behavior was. And this could be any code that you want down here. It could be an Ajax request, it could be a number of different function calls, anything you want. The important part is that we've already told the event, hey, whatever you had planned, forget about it. And that's it. So let's save this, and let's go try it out. Let's go back to Mozilla Firefox. Let's go back to our main form page. Here we are. Let's reload the page. And let's try 2, 3, and 4. We'll click submit. And there you see, we get our Ajax request back. And if you want to know how it would work if the user didn't have JavaScript, well, then you can simply take this button add event listener code and just comment it out. That's what would happen, right? All this other JavaScript would be ignored as well. But the key part, the thing that kicks things off, is this add event listener code. So that's what it would be like if you didn't have JavaScript enabled. You'd have 2, 3, and 4. We click submit, and we get back this page instead. And you get that experience. But when they do have JavaScript, they get a much slicker version of the site than they would have otherwise. So now we have a respectable Ajax form. We've learned how to create the form, how to gather those form values, how to handle the errors, how to indicate to the user that the loading is in progress. We've also seen how we can disable the button to prevent subsequent requests, and we've been able to add some progressive enhancement so that users who don't have JavaScript still get a decent experience as well. In this chapter, we will learn how to use Ajax and PHP to implement infinite scrolling. Infinite scrolling is a popular technique that you may have seen and not quite known what it was called. The idea is that when a user scrolls to the bottom of the existing page content, then additional content loads onto the page using Ajax. It's very prevalent on the internet, and you've probably experienced it on sites like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Pinterest. If you go to any of those sites and you go to the list of data, so the status updates or the tweets or the images, then you can scroll to the bottom of the page and you can watch as new content appears. And that allows you to just keep scrolling. And then when you get to the bottom of that content, just like magic, new content is loaded into the browser. And again, you can keep scrolling down that next set of results. In order to implement infinite scrolling, there are a few things we need to do. First, we're going to need to come up with our initial set of items. And then we're going to need to write code which can retrieve additional items. We can think of these items as being pages of items. They're collections or sets, but we often talk about them in terms of pages. So when we start out, we're viewing page 1, and then our next request is going to ask the server to give us page 2. So then we can get back a second set of items. We put those on the page, and now when we ask for the next one, it's page 3, and so on. We're going to need to keep track of the current page, because obviously we just loaded page 4, then we know that our next request needs to be for page 5. So we need to keep track of which page we're on. Fire an Ajax call whenever the browser is near the end of the content. There's actually two parts to this. First, it means we're going to have to learn to detect the current scroll position relative to the content length. And second, we're going to need to bind our Ajax call to that scroll event. Let's start by taking a look at those initial set of items. I've got a project that we can use to start out with, and it's called Ajax_scroll. You can see I put that in my sites directory. You can put it anywhere that you can access it through a web browser and use PHP. This is also included in the exercise files if you have access to those. Let's open up index.php and start there. You can see it's a basic HTML page. We've got some CSS up at the top. Most of it is just styling the way that our blog posts are going to look. Now, if you watch the chapter on asynchronous button submission for our favorite button, then you'll recognize these blog posts from there. It's the same idea. We have blog post 101, 102, and 103. And I've taken out the HTML that has to do with the favoriting. You certainly could leave it in there, but I just didn't want it to be a distraction, so I've taken it out completely. And you can bring this up in a browser and see what it looks like by going to localhost. For me, my web directory is going to be served up as ~Kevin Skoglund and then Ajax_scroll. There it is. That's what it looks like right now. Blog post 101, 102, and 103. And you can see at the bottom I've got a load more button down here. We'll come back to that in a minute. So if we scroll down, you'll see that I've got that load more button, but I've also got a spinner right here. Spinner was something that we talked about in the last chapter. If you want to learn how to implement this, you can go back and review that there. The basic idea is that we put an animated GIF on the page, and then we show it when we start the process of communicating with the server, and we hide it again whenever we stop that process, whenever we get a response back. So I'm just doing the same thing here, and you can see I've got that animated image file right here in my project directory. Now let's take a look at the JavaScript that we've already got. You can see that I've got a container defined. That's just finding those blog posts. The idea is this container is where I'm going to put additional pages of blog posts. So as I get them in from Ajax, I need to know where I'm going to put them, and that's where it's going to go, inside that div. So there'll just be more divs that get added onto the 3 that I have now. And then I've got that load more button. I've gone ahead and located that and called it just load more. Here's my JavaScript code for showing and hiding the spinner. Then I'm also showing load more and hiding load more. The idea is just while the spinner's there, I should hide the button. So I'll put the spinner up and take the button away, and then reverse the process when the request comes back. Here's my function called load more. Before we dive into that, let's just look down at the bottom and notice that I'm taking that load more button and I'm adding an event listener, and when you click on it, it's going to call load more. So let's go back up here. You see it's going to show the spinner, it's going to hide load more, and then it's going to fire my Ajax request. That Ajax request is a GET request. It's going to go to blog_post.php, and I'm going to send it a parameter of page 1 for now. We'll come back and work on additional pages later, but just to get us started, it's going to return page 1. It's setting a request header for requested with so that we know it's Ajax. And then I've got onReady state change defined so that when ready state comes back and it's successful, I'll grab the response text and I'll be able to work with it. I'll hide the spinner, I'll append the results to the end of the blog posts, and then I'll show that load more button again. We'll come back and we'll fill out this comment later with some actual code. And then we send that request here. So this already works to some extent. If we go back to our browser, and let's bring up our web console, and then I'll come down and let's click load more, and you can see that it gave me back some data. We'll see that code in just a second, but you can see I got back a result, but it didn't do anything with it. It didn't put it in this page. There's also something else. Notice that it gave me page 1, blog post 101, blog post 102, blog post 103. It gave me those to begin with. So what I'm actually going to do is, instead of having all of those in here, let's go ahead and take them out. Let me just fold them up. I'm going to take all 3 of those blog posts and I'm just going to remove them. And then what I'm going to do is actually come down here and uncomment this line, and I'm going to call load more right at the bottom of my JavaScript. So the very first thing it's going to do is load the page, and then it's going to send an asynchronous request to populate the page with the first bit of data. Firing Ajax right after the page loads is a useful technique. Imagine a page where the main layout loaded and then an item that's over in the sidebar loaded asynchronously. Or you could have a slideshow. I've created slideshows where the first image loads right away, but then all the additional images load using Ajax in the background. So now when we save it, we'll come back to our Firefox page, let's reload it, and as soon as we load it, you'll see that it fired off that request, right? So we got back our results right here, but now our page is empty because we're not doing anything with those results. We're not putting them on the page. Next movie, let's take a look at how we generated this response and also learn how to use it on our page. In this movie, we will learn how to process the request to load in more items and also how to append those items to a div on the current page. In the previous movie, we were able to fire off the Ajax request and we got back a response, and the response is exactly what we would want. We got back HTML that contains our blog posts 101, 102, and 103. Let's go and take a look at the code that was already there that did this for us. This code is code that I had already written, so you have access to it. Let me just fold this up for a moment so we can look at the heart of this here. So we've got a function here for whether this is an Ajax request or not. If it's not an Ajax request, we're just going to exit. I'm going to get the current page. Remember that was sent along in the request? It was a GET request and it was blogpost.php page equals 1. So it gets that value, which is 1. It makes sure that it's an integer. If not, it also defaults to 1. So that's going to be my variable page. Then I'm going to call a function find blog posts for that page. So I should just be able to pass it a page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, and it should be able to figure out what blog posts are appropriate to return. And I'm going to assign those to this variable blog post. Let's take a look at this find blog post function. Let's go up here and unfold this again so we can see what it does. Now typically this find blog post would probably be a call to a database, but I'm not using a database here. I'm just going to create a fake database so that we don't have to deal with all the setup and everything that goes into having a database. But the idea here is that you would just query your database and you would tell it which records it ought to return, and it would return those records to you. So here I've said that my first post is 101. I need to know that just so I can perform some calculations. I've set a per page value of 3. It's very easy for you to change that per page value to be something else. If you have pagination built into your code that works with your database, you might be able to just set the per page value. And then I've got offset. Offset is how many records do we want to skip over to return the current record. And so we need to have a formula that does that. And it's the current page minus 1 times the items per page plus 1. So that tells us the offset from where we should be starting. If you stop and look at that formula for a minute, you'll realize that if the current page is 1, then 1 minus 1 will be 0. 0 times per page would also be 0. And then plus 1 would be 1. So we want to start with record number 1. If we were on page 2, then 2 minus 1 would be 1, times per page would be 3, and then 3 plus 1 would be 4. So the next item that we should have on the second page would be 4, right? 1, 2, 3 on the first page, 4, 5, 6 on the next page, and so on. So then I've got an array of blog posts that I'm building up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write just a simple for loop here. It'll go from 0 until we get to per page, and it's going to increment I. You can see that the ID of the first post I'm determining here by using a formula. And then I've got a blog post here, and the blog post I'm building up is going to be an array. It's an associative array that has an ID, a title, and content. And I've got values for those. ID is going to be the ID I just figured out up here. Blog post is going to be blog post and then that ID after it. And then content is going to be the content here that's just lorem ipsum text, just a placeholder bit of text. Then once I have all of that together, I'm going to take that blog post I just assembled and I'm going to add it to the end of my array, into blog posts. And at the end, I'll just return all those blog posts. So in case it's not clear what it's doing, I'm basically building up this for each one of my items. So it's either 101, 102, 103, and it comes back with text like that, and it's going to return those as a PHP array. So again, this was probably something you would do by querying a database. And the database would probably return values to you in either this kind of associative array format, or it might be an object-oriented format. But you get the idea. Once I have blog posts, then I can have for each statement that goes through that data and outputs HTML for it. I've got a div with blog post. I'm going to echo the blog post ID. And then I've got another h3 tag, which displays the title, and p tags around the content. Again, I tried to keep it as similar to what you would have if you were working with an actual database. And that's how we get the data back that's returned here. So let's go back and load our Ajax scroll request, hit return, and you can see the HTML is returned in the result. The result comes back. We have code that just logs it to our console, right? Console log result. So this is the response text that we're looking at. We're just looking at the raw response text we're getting back, and it's returning back HTML. Now you could return back JSON and then use JavaScript to assemble this, but I personally, when I'm writing HTML, I prefer to do it here in this code and to write my HTML this way. In the next chapter, we'll actually see the opposite instance where I will return JSON and then I'll use that to build HTML. But for now, I'm going to put this HTML here in my PHP code and just return a big block of HTML as a response, and then we'll see how to work with that in the next movie. Now that we understand the starting code, we're ready to roll up our sleeves and implement infinite scrolling. The next step is to append those HTML results to an element in the DOM, or Document Object Model. So how do we take this block of HTML that's here and put it inside the div that's up here? In the past, we've been using inner HTML to set the value of that HTML. And it's possible to use inner HTML here, but it's not the best choice. And the reason why is that inner HTML is used to replace the entire contents of a div. And we don't want to replace the contents, we want to append them to the end. So we're going to have to do it a little bit differently. Let's go into our code, and inside the load more function, right here where we append results to the blog posts, So right below append results to end a blog post, let's write a call to a new function, which doesn't exist yet. We'll call it append to div. And it's going to have two arguments. We're going to pass it the container that it ought to append to and the content we want to be appended. So the first argument is going to be our container. We had that up here. The container is this blog post element. And the second thing is going to be the new HTML we want to use, which is result. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take result and we're going to put it into container. And append to div has to sort that out for us. So let's come up here and let's define that function now. Function append to div, and it takes two arguments, the first of which is the container, and the second of which is the new HTML that it wants to use. Now I don't want to call this container here. Let's call it div, just so that it doesn't conflict with the container that we've already defined. So the first thing that we need to do when we're working with new HTML that comes in from an Ajax request is we need to be able to work with it like we work with the DOM. Now the browser parses all the elements that are on the page and has those available so that we can address them using JavaScript. And we can ask for different elements and it can find things the same way that we did up here when we called getElementById. But we can't do that to this new HTML yet because it hasn't been processed in that way by the browser. So we have to get that process to happen. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a temporary variable. We're going to call document create element. We're going to make a div. So it's a new div assigned to temp. And then we can say temp.inner HTML equals our new HTML. And voila, by doing this process, now all of that HTML gets processed by the browser and it's addressable. It's not just text anymore. Now it's addressable HTML elements that we can work with. So I'm just going to put a note here to let you know that's what we're doing. So put the new HTML into a temp div. This causes browser to parse it as elements. Okay, so that's the first trick that we need to know. Once we've done that, then we can find and work with those elements. So I'm going to do that by calling var class name equals, I'm going to use that temp node that we just had. I'm going to find first element child dot class name. Now there's also something called first child, but I'm calling first element child, and I'll talk about why in just a moment. Next, I'm going to find out the list of all the items that are in there by temp.getElements by class name. Okay, so if you've worked with JavaScript a lot before, you're probably familiar with this. But the thing is that there are children of temp, and those children you would think would be the three divs that we just put inside it. But in fact, there's additional children as well, and it's because of that white space that's there. That additional white space counts as a child. I'm not going to demonstrate how this works, but it's a well-documented part of one of the quirks of how JavaScript works. So if we call first child, we might not be getting the actual div that we want. We might be getting the white space instead. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, go get the first child and find out its class name, then go back and get only those three elements, those three divs. Let's just refresh our memory what those are. Let's go back here. Here it is, div blog post 101, class blog post, right? So I'm going in, I'm finding this first element, I'm getting its class name, which is blog post, and then I'm going back in and saying, all right, look in there and give me only the three things called blog post. Ignore all the other child nodes, which are actually white space. So I'll just make an additional note here, use first element child because of how DOM treats white space. Okay, so now I actually have the items. I have the three items that I want to work with. So now we want to write a for loop that'll go through each of those. Now you might think, well, let's write a for loop like we've had in the past. I equals 0 and I is less than items length, I plus plus. And then for each of those items, let's take our container, our div, and let's append child. Append child is what allows us to be able to append items onto the end. Instead of using inner HTML, we want to append child. So we'll take each one of our items and we'll just take the first one each time. So we'll go through the items, the first one in the array, and we'll take it out. So let's try it out. Let's see how close we got. Let's save it. We'll go back to Firefox and let's reload the page. And voila, blog post 1, blog post 2. Oh, wait a minute. Where's blog post 3? Why did we only get 2 of them? There were 3 that came back in the data. Well, here's the problem. The issue that we're having here is that item's length is dynamic. Every time it comes back and it checks to see if I is less than item's length, guess what? It checks the dynamic value of items at that point. And every time we call append child, this is actually taking an item out of the temporary div and moving it into the permanent div, the place that we want to keep it. So every time length is changing. So the solution is that we just need to have another variable here we'll call len, which is equal to items length. So that'll get the length at the start, and now it won't change. Now we find out the item's length at the beginning, and that's how many times we run it. Let's save it. We'll go back and try it out. Reload it. Blog post 1, blog post 2, blog post 3. So we've navigated a few different quirks here. Let's just review them quickly. First, we needed to take our new HTML and we needed to make the elements that are inside of it addressable. And we did that by creating a temporary element using create element and then just dropping that HTML into there. That allowed those elements to be addressable. But then we had the next problem. And the next problem is that there's all this extra white space that's in there that gets treated as a child if we're not careful. So in order to avoid that white space and all those issues, we wanted to first find out the class name that we were working with, and then find all the elements which have that class name. That gives us just the real true elements. And then the third issue that we had to work through was that we wanted to loop through all of the items and take each one, the first item each time, and append it to our div. But we have to do that while making sure that item's length isn't changing at the same time as we're running our loop. So we needed to make sure we had a static value that we could use for that loop. Now we have the first part of our code working. We can go back to Firefox. When we load the page, it loads those first 3 items in, and it does it by taking this request and appending them to the current DOM into that blog posts div. But load more doesn't work the way it ought to, because when we click load more each time, it adds more, but look, it adds blog post 101, 102, 103 again. If I click load more, it adds more elements to the DOM exactly as we'd want, but you'll notice that the ID is not right. And the reason why that's true is because every time we send our JavaScript request over here, we're sending it with page equal to 1. We need to be able to tell it the next page. We need to keep track of the page that we're on and tell it what page it should be returning subsequent times. In the last movie, we learned to append Ajax results to a div on the page, but we were getting results for page 1 back every time. In this movie, we will learn to send different page numbers in our request and then learn how to keep track of the current page by using a data attribute. So we've seen how we make our request always using page 1. That's just a static value. What we want to do now is we want to be able to have our new page variable be set here. So page is what we're going to be working with. Let's actually call it next page. And that's what the value we want to come up with. We want to figure out how do we determine what is next page. So let's first figure out how we determine what the current page is. And then we'll be able to figure out var next page from there, because that'll be page plus 1. So the current page could be a value that we just simply kept track of. We could start out with a value of 1, and then every time we could increment that value to be 2. We could just maintain that in JavaScript. But I'm actually going to do it a different way. I'm going to do it by using something called a data attribute. If you haven't used these before, the way it works is that we go up to our HTML up here, and we have our load more button. We're going to add an attribute to this. Now we have an attribute here of ID equals load more. Now we're going to add one called data-page. This is a made-up attribute. This is my own attribute of my own definition. The idea is that we can have data-whatever we want. It can be data-foo, data-hello, doesn't matter. So I'm going to call it page, and then I can set this value equal to anything I want. So I'm going to say that at the start, when we first come to this page and nothing has been loaded, we're on page 0, because even the first page hasn't loaded at the beginning. So we're on page 0. So now I can get that value back. I can use JavaScript to retrieve this value, and then I can work with it from there. And then this will also give me a place where I can contain the updates. I can just increment that value and save it to the DOM so that it's always there. So let's come back down into our load more, and instead of having page, let's call load more get attribute, and then I can call data-page. Modern browsers also support another type of query called data set, but unfortunately IE 8 and 9 don't support it. And then let's also add another line here, which is some JavaScript parse int, and that'll make sure that we're dealing with an integer value so that we can then add 1 to it. So this will get back that attribute, and then we can add 1 to it. So now that we know what the current page is, the next page will get called appropriately. But then we also need to have some code which will increment the page. Let's write another function up here, function set current page, and we'll pass in some value, and then we're going to call load more set attribute data page is going to be equal to whatever page we've passed in. Now this page here is a local value. This is local to this one, but load more is in the global scope. That's something we defined earlier. Okay, and let's just add a line here too, just so we can see it. Console log, let's make it incrementing page 2 plus, and we'll put the page there. All right, so now what we have to do is call set current page at the time that we want to increment the page. So where's the right place to do that? We want to do it after we get back a response. So before we display the results, let's increment the current page. Set current page is going to be equal to next page. Voila. That should do it for us. Let's go back and check it all out. Let's load the page. Blog post 1, blog post 2, blog post 3. We can actually click inspector so we can take a look here. Let's look at, where's the load more? Here it is, load more container. Load more data page 1. That's exactly what we would want. So now let's click load more. Voila. Post number 104, post number 105, post number 106. So here we are, you see this is data page 2, right? So every time we click it, it increments this value from 2 to 3, and it gives us the next page of results. Now we've got something that's getting closer to our infinite scrolling. Now we have not automatic scrolling, but we have the ability to click this load more button each time and get another set of content, right? Another page of content back. What we need now is to be able to have this happen for us automatically, to have that load more happen when we get to the bottom of the page. In the last movie, we got our load more button working correctly, so that it can retrieve pages of items and append them to a div on the current page correctly. Now, we're ready to add the infinite scrolling part. We just need to be able to trigger that same Ajax function, load more, and we need to do it whenever a user scrolls to the bottom of the current content. We aren't going to be able to do it all in one step exactly. What we first need to do is we need to bind a function to our onScroll event. So the way we do that is with window.onScroll, all lowercase, equals to, we're going to make an anonymous function here, and inside there we're going to call scroll reaction. All right, so anything that we want to do with scroll is going to be handled by scroll reaction function. It's a function that I'm going to write, and every time that the window scrolls, this function will be called. Every time, not just when we get to the bottom of the content. Every single time we do any scrolling, this function gets called. So now let's go up here and let's define that function. Function scroll reaction. Inside this scroll reaction function, we now need to figure out when we call load more and when we don't. So we need to take some measurements first. Var content height is going to be equal to container. That's our blog post container. We want to get its offset height. Then we want to do var current y, our y coordinate. We want to figure that out by using window.innerHeight plus window.page y offset. Now you can look up more information about these JavaScript functions, offset height, inner height, page y offset, to find out what they are and exactly how they work. But the idea here is that we're finding out the height of the content, and then we're figuring out where we are relative to that. Let's add another line here so we can see this. Console log current y plus, let's just slash, plus the content height. So that'll log it. So let's try that first. Let's just save this. Let's come back over here. Let's reload our page and watch the log down there as I scroll. Voila, see those numbers? And the target number, the content number, is 763. So as I get closer to 763, I want to be able to scroll, and as soon as I get to that 763, right, as soon as this content pops up here, that's where I want it to trigger, right around there. That's where I want it to fire and send off a new Ajax request. So at that point, then there'll be more content that I can scroll. So how do we write that? Let's write if current y is greater than or equal to content height. So as soon as it's greater than that number, then what do we want to do? We want to fire off this Ajax request. Load more. Now keep in mind, this is calling this function every single time that we scroll. We see that because we're getting updated data every single time. But it only calls load more when these conditions are met. Let's see that in action. We'll reload our page. Now I'm scrolling. You can see that it is calling that function because I am getting updates down here, but it's not till I get down to the bottom of it. Scroll down, boom. Did you see that? Incrementing to page 2, and I got a whole bunch of new data. Let's keep scrolling. Look at that. Blog posts 4, 5, and 6. Here's 4, 5, and 6. Wait a minute, something's weird there. So now we have infinite scrolling working, but there's something else that's going on here that's not quite right. Let's talk about what it is and learn how to fix it in the next movie. In the previous movie, we added infinite scrolling, but we ran into a problem. The problem is that our code is sending too many Ajax requests, and we need to learn how to prevent that from happening. The problem we ran into, you can see we have blog posts 104, 105, and 106, but before that we also had 104, 105, and 106. You may be wondering, well, how did that happen? What's going on here? We can actually see the problem a little bit better if we come over to a blog post and we make it into a slow server by simulating that, by telling this script that it ought to sleep for 2 seconds. So now let's go back over here to Firefox. Let's reload our page, and the first page loads. We have blog post 101, 102, and 103. We scroll down and it's loading, and we got 4, 5, and 6. We got 104 again. So what's happening there? Let's try it one more time, see if we can tell. We get the first page. All right, now I'm going to get to the bottom and I'm going to trigger it. We're going to see it trigger, right? We're getting close, 745. And as soon as it triggers, I'm going to keep scrolling. Now, while I was scrolling, oh, look at that. Another one triggered. Let's scroll up and see it said incrementing to page 2, incrementing to page 2. It triggered more than once. We sent off more than one Ajax request. And the reason why is because Ajax is asynchronous. So when we were scrolling, we added code here that said, all right, every time you're scrolling, react to it. And we have code up here that says, all right, the reaction should be that if you're in the right spot, fire off an Ajax request. So while that Ajax request was going on, I scrolled a bit more. So what did it do? It called scroll reaction, said, hey, are you in that magic spot where we should call load more? Oh, you are still. Let's fire off another request. And it would keep firing off requests. Every time that I scroll, it would fire off another request. So load more is going to get called over and over and over again. It's going to fire off a whole bunch of Ajax requests, and that's not what we want. What we really want is to stop additional requests from happening while there's a request in progress. The easiest way to do that is to set a variable up here in our JavaScript, right underneath load more, and we're going to call it request in progress equals false. At the beginning, there's not a request in progress. But now we can set this to true anytime there's a request in progress, and we can check that value then. So now we can come back down here to our code for load more, and let's put at the very beginning of it, if request is in progress, then return. That's it. Do nothing. If request in progress, then just don't do the rest of this function. Now, if it is not in progress, then what's the next thing we should do? We should set request progress equal to true, right? So the request is in progress. Now we need to come down into our code, and down here after show load more, request progress equals false. We're done at this point. Okay, see how that works? So load more will get called all the time. We'll get multiple calls of that just like we did before, but it won't fire an asynchronous Ajax request. That's the key part. The JavaScript function gets fired, right? So we scroll calls scroll reaction. Scroll reaction says, hey, You look like you're in the right spot. I'm going to call load more. Load more says, yeah, I'm not going to fire another one right now. I'm busy. I've already got one in progress. And as soon as that one's done, then it's eligible to do the next one. But at that point, we've already added the new content. It's already been appended. Our container size should have changed. So the new numbers are going to be in place. So that's what it takes. This request in progress variable is going to block the action for us and make sure that it only happens when its value is set to false. Let's try it to see the difference. Let's save. Let's go back to Firefox, reload the page. All right, so now we get 1, 2, and 3. Now I'm waiting for 4. I'm going to start scrolling. 4, 5, 6. I'm just going to start scrolling. Oh, look, nothing happened. Scroll, scroll. I'm getting the right numbers every time because it's actually waiting and not doing anything, not firing another Ajax request until the first one is through. This is an important technique when you're working with Ajax. Because my Ajax request is asynchronous and because I've bound a function to something that I'm going to let the user still do, this scroll event. It's very similar to how we disabled the form button so that the user couldn't submit the form more than once. But here, it's not a form that the user could potentially hit. The user just might scroll innocently and it would trigger our function again. So we've got to make sure that we protect that and disable the function until the previous request has finished. As a final step, let's just come out here and let's remove this console logging because we're doing lots of logging there. And let's go back and just marvel at the infinite scroll that we've created. So here we are. Here's our scroll. We get blog post 1, 2, 3. We pause. We get 4, 5, and 6. We get a brief pause. 7, 8, and 9. A brief pause. And it just keeps going, right? Now we'll go back and we'll actually make this not a slow server anymore. And now we'll get a much speedier version where it just feels like we're just scrolling along and the content just never ends. It just keeps going and keeps going. All the while, Ajax is actually making requests in the background on my behalf. In this chapter, we will implement a search autosuggest feature using Ajax. I'm sure you've seen autosuggest in action before. It's very popular. The idea is that as a user is typing into a text input field, the web page then displays suggestions below the text input. In other words, it takes the data the user's typing and uses that to make suggestions in order to save them typing. Those suggestions could be used to populate the text input field simply as text, or they could be links that take you to either search results or to a specific content page. The idea is to try to speed up the user experience and help the user have to type less to get to where they want to go. It's very useful. One of the best examples of autosuggest is still one of the first places that it was ever used, and that's the main Google page. If you go to google.com and in the text box you start typing LYNDA, you see that I get suggestions below suggesting what I might want to go to. Right? So these are just links then that take me to where I want to go to help me with my search results. It's become a common feature of most websites. For example, here's another one on Amazon.com. As I start typing the word books, B-O-O-K-S, you can see that it starts offering me suggestions for what I might mean. What might I want to actually click on? We're going to be doing the same thing in a project throughout this chapter. The idea is that we're going to do it for a global search box. You can see that I've already got a starter project inside my sites directory. That'll be included in the exercise files if you have access to those. If not, we're going to walk through them together. Before we actually look at any of the pages, let's go ahead and bring it up in our browser so we can see what it looks like. I think that'll be the most helpful. Localhost, and for me that's going to be localhost tilde Kevin Skogland / Ajax _ autosuggest. So you can see that I have a mock-up of a very simple site here. I've got a header, I've got a body, at the bottom I've got a footer, and over here in the upper right corner we've got this text input. The idea is that this would be the global search box. It would search throughout this website for whatever content we wanted. And you can see that it's already a working search box. If I type something here like test and I click search, it does take me to another search page, right? Search.php. Here's my search results. You searched for, and here's the term that I searched for. I can go back to the main page using this link. Now I can also go test, and you'll see that I can also search again just directly from this text box, right? It's all just the same box that always works, and it will do my search. But we don't have autosuggest here. At the moment, it's just a simple search. We type in a phrase, we click search. It'd be much more user-friendly if we could make suggestions to the users about their search terms. Now that we've got the big picture, let's take a look at the code. Because I wanted to be able to have that header that always works, I put it into an includes file. So in the past, we've been working with a single page. Now we're working with a couple of different parts that are being loaded in. So I've got header.php that contains the beginning of my HTML document all the way down to here. And then I've got footer.php, which contains the end of my document. And here's the footer and closes it up here. Let's go back to header.php. You'll notice that we're loading in a style sheet so that it's always have all those styles available. And same thing with our JavaScript. We're putting all of our JavaScript in one file. Then you'll see I've got a div with ID of main, another div ID of header, and then inside my header I've got a navigation. That's where you see that link for main page that's up there. Potentially that could be a lot of different links to take you to lots of different parts of the site. And then I've got this part here that's the search area, div ID search area, and inside there is my search form and also a place where I'm going to have my suggestions later. I've already got a placeholder there for it. We'll come back and work on those later. Notice that the search form has an action that will send it to search.php. That's this page right here. And notice also that it's using a GET request. GET request is very common when we're doing a search because we're not posting data, we're getting back data. And it has the added benefit that then you can actually have the query in the URL string, and that makes it bookmarkable, and that's nice. Next, I've got some PHP code that's checking to see if there is a current value for Q. Q is the name of the value that I'm submitting in that search box. Q is very common just because it's short. It's short for query. So Q equals, and then whatever the search term is. And if there is one existing, then I'm going to go ahead and use that as the value. And I'm just escaping that with HTML special characters and outputting it inside that value. And then I've got a simple submit. That's all there is to it. It's really just basic HTML and PHP. Let's take a look at the index.php page. You can see that this is also very simple. We're just loading in that header, we're loading in the footer, and then in between, I've just got some static page content. This could be anything that's on the home page. It's just a placeholder. And then let's take a look at search.php. Again, another very simple page. It includes the header, it includes the footer, and I've just got some static text here in the middle. The only difference is that I've got PHP that's outputting the current query. I'm finding that query up here, and then I'm just outputting it here. So this is what you search for. I'm not actually performing a search. That's basic PHP, and I think you could probably do that. You would go to the database, you would ask it to return your records. We want to focus on the autosuggest. So here we're just going to say you searched for and put what the query was in there. It's really just a placeholder. Now let's take a look at the CSS file. Inside here you can see I've just got some general styles for the HTML and the body, for the main element, the header and the footer. I've just given them a background, given them a height and a width. And then the page content, same thing, giving it a background. The navigation I floated to the left. I give a little bit of style to its link tag there. And then the search area I've just floated to the right. In the input I've given a width. That's really all there is. Now we'll come back and add styles for the autosuggest later on. Those are not there yet. We're going to do that together. And let's look at public.js to see what's in here. Now, because we're including the JavaScript at the top of our page, we need to add a little bit of code here that says don't execute right away. Hold off until the DOM is loaded. That's a basic JavaScript principle. If we don't have those elements, we can't address them yet. In the previous chapters, we've been putting all of our JavaScript at the end of the document, so that wasn't an issue. Here I'm using an event listener called DOM content loaded. That's available in most browsers, unfortunately not in Internet Explorer 8. There are some workarounds for that that you can look up if you need to support Internet Explorer 8. I won't go into those workarounds here because I really want us to focus on the Ajax part. You can see that we're finding some elements by their ID just so that we have them available. You can see that we have a get suggestions function. That's what's going to actually go and get our suggestions via Ajax. It's going to take that search field and get its value and assign it to Q. And then it's going to call autosuggest.php and pass in Q. Notice that that's a GET request. It'll submit that request in, it'll get back data as JSON, we'll parse it, and we'll pass it off to this function's show suggestions. We haven't written that function yet. We'll do that a little later. And then we'll also need to make sure that we uncomment this line later to add an event listener that will listen as the user's typing to know when we should get those suggestions. And last of all, let me just show you what's in autosuggest.php. It's really just a placeholder for the code that we're going to work on later. and that's just got the basic checking to see if something is an Ajax request. It's going to exit if it's not an Ajax request, and then it's going to set up that query value for us, and then we'll write the code later to find and return search suggestions. So that's the code that we're going to start with. It's going to give us a website that looks something like this. Now that we understand the code that we're starting with, and we already have this text input ready for us to use, we're ready to see how we can put suggestions below it. In this movie, we will add some CSS styles for our suggestions. Now, of course, we don't have suggestions coming back from Ajax yet, but we can start by styling static text. Let's open up a couple of files. Let's open up includes header.php, and let's also open up public.css. Those are the ones we're going to be working with. The idea is that we want to add suggestions that are going to appear here, and then we want to style them using our CSS. Now, even though we don't have actual suggestions yet, I like to do this part first, partly so that they just end up over here in the right place. So we want to at least have some minimal styles so that our list appears here. Even if it's ugly, we want the list to be below the search box. We don't want it to show up somewhere else on the page. We want it to be in the right spot. So the one good way to do that, to see how it's going to look ahead of time, is just to come into the page and to put in some static tags. Just to write HTML here, put a placeholder, and then we'll take it out and put dynamic data in later on. What I want to do is I want to put li tags in here, something like this. I've got an example here with just alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and you can see that each one of these is going to be an li tag with a link inside. The link is going to go to search.php, and q is going to be equal to whatever that search term is. And so when we click on the link, it should execute that page, right? It should bring us to that search page with that suggestion activated. So let's try it out just like that. Let's save it. Let's go into Firefox. Let's reload our page, and there they are. Right there, we've got the beginnings of something. Now that's not styled very well. What we really want is to have each one of these kind of appear as a box underneath. So we want each one of those not to just be clickable on the word, but we want anywhere in the box to be clickable, anywhere that would take us to it. So let's see if we can do that with some CSS. Let's go into our public CSS, and down here at the bottom, under our autosuggest styles, let's add a couple styles. I'll just add some line returns, so that's not at the bottom of my page. And let's add suggestions, that's the name of it. And we're going to make list style equal to none. That'll take away those dots in front of it. Let's go ahead and make it margin 0, padding 0, and let's make it have a width of 208 pixels. And then I'm going to go ahead and add another one here for suggestions li, but we're actually not going to add any styles there right now. We'll leave that like it is. Instead, what I'm more interested in is the links. I want to style those links. And the idea is that if the links are styled with a certain width, the li will expand to fill that same space. We can determine the size by the size of these links. So the links normally are going to be inline style. Instead, we want to have display block. And let's give them a minimum height of 1 EM. And we'll put some padding around them because we want it to be sort of a box effect. I'm going to use 0.5 EM, that'll be on the top and the bottom, and 10 pixels on the left and the right. And let's give them a background color so that our box really stands out. We'll just make it gray. And let's give the text a color of black. And then last of all, we want our links to be text, decoration, none. All right, so let's just see where that gets us so far. Let's go back. Let's reload our page. Look at that. We've got alpha, beta, gamma, delta, each one sort of displayed as a box. And you can put a border around it if you want to see where one box stops and the other one starts. But it looks a little nicer when it's just all continuous like that. Now I'm going to add one more thing. Since we took away the text decoration on those, let's just take this definition here and let's make one for hover. And when we hover over it, let's just change the background to a different color. We'll make it AAA, a different shade of gray. Come back, let's reload the page. There you go. That's the effect we were looking for. So I'll be typing up here, test, right? Maybe I'm typing the word alpha. And as I'm typing, I type ALP, then alpha should appear down here. And there presumably be other ones. Now, obviously, these aren't the results that we're looking for. These are just placeholders, but you start to see how this interface feels. So that's a pretty good start for us. And let's go ahead and click one of these and see what happens. If we click alpha, and sure enough, we get another page. It says alpha up here. You search for alpha. That's exactly what we'd want. Click on beta, and that's what we get as well. Now, we don't want this here all the time. we're going to want it to show and hide itself. So when the page first loads, we're going to want it to be display none. And then when we get results back, then we'll make it display. So let's save that. We'll come back over here. We reload the page. And of course, now we can't see it anymore, even though it's there. So even though we don't have all of our JavaScript written yet, let's go ahead and go into public.js. And under show suggestions, we know one of the things that show suggestions is going to need to do is it's going to need to call suggestions, which we found up here. Right? It's going to take that element. It's going to call style display equals block. And that will make those suggestions display again. So once we call show suggestions, it'll make our list reappear. Now, at the moment, show suggestions is down here inside our Ajax query for get suggestions, but nothing is calling get suggestions. We haven't actually wired that up to be an event listener. So nothing ever calls get suggestions and it never becomes visible. In the next movie, let's learn how we can do that. In this movie, we will write code to send Ajax requests as the user is typing in the text input field. The idea is that as the user is typing in the field, we want to fire this get suggestions function so that it goes and it gets the suggestions from autosuggest.php, which it gets back as JSON, which it then populates that list with. But it all starts with get suggestions. So we need to have an event listener that's going to call get suggestions. So let's uncomment that line. We want to tell the search input. We already figured out what that was up here with get element by ID search. We want to tell it to add an event listener. We know that we want it to call get suggestions. False is actually an optional option. It's actually the default, so we can take it out. But what do we want to bind this to? What's going to be the action that we want to look for? It's not going to be a click like it was when we had a button or when we had a form, and it's not a scroll event like we had before. There are two possibilities for what we could use here. The first is we could use change, C-H-A-N-G-E. Every time something changes, let's listen for that and bind that to it. Let's try that, and to see how it works, let's go up into get suggestions, and let's just add a line here for testing. Console log get suggestions. So every time it fires, it'll log it, and then after that, let's just put return. So none of this code will actually execute. We're just going to log to the console and then return. So let's save it, and let's just try that out. Go back, let's reload our page, and let's type ALPH. Oops, let me show the log here. Console, web console, here it is. Don't worry about the unreachable code after the return statement. That's just letting us know that we did some bad JavaScript there. ALPHA. Wait a minute, why is it not firing down here? Now watch this. When I click outside the box, boom, get suggestions fired. Let's try it again. Let's try hello. Didn't fire. Click outside the box, boom, now it fired. And that's the way that change works. Change works by firing every time we leave the input field. That's not what we really want here. Instead, what we'd much rather have is have it with every keystroke. And for that, we need input. So every time it gets input, that's when it will fire. Let's make a note here so we don't forget. Use input, which is every key, not change, which is only when it loses focus. All right, now let's try it again with input and let's see the difference. Let's go back, reload our page. I'll type A, L, P, H, A. Now you're only seeing it once here, but you'll notice that this number here increments, right? Watch that go from 5 to 6. That's because it's actually compressing those down into a single line. It's saying the same output was received again another time. So you can see that it is firing every single time. So that's awesome. That's what we want. So let's go back and let's actually take out our console with load suggestions, and let's instead let it go ahead with our Ajax request. It's going to send a request to autosuggest.php. Autosuggest.php is going to return something to us. We don't know what it is. Let's don't parse it just yet because who knows what that's going to end up yielding. Let's go ahead and make this say that the result will force it to just be a string that's empty. All right, that at least gives us some valid JSON that it'll get back. So we're going to force result to suddenly become an empty string. We'll parse it. We'll pass that to show suggestions. Show suggestions should display our block there. Let's try it. Let's save it. We'll go back over. Let's reload our page. And as I type A, boom, it appeared. Just like that. All right. Now I noticed that it didn't go away when I had nothing there. And I'm also thinking that we probably don't want to start doing a search when we just have a single character. We could, but it's more common to let the user type about 3 characters before we execute the search. At that point, we have a much more limited set of search results. When we type A, there's so many possibilities that it could be that it's probably not even useful to return results at that point. So let's add a little bit of code that will wait until we have 3 characters, and that will also erase the style if we don't have 3 characters. Inside get suggestions, I'll add q.length. If it's less than 3, then suggestions style display is going to be equal to none. Make it hide again, and we'll just return. We won't do anything further, we'll just return back out of the JavaScript. Let's try that now. Come back, reload our page. A, L, didn't do anything. I typed the P, boom. Now it suddenly appears. Let's take away the P, disappears again. See how that works? Now I'm not getting live search results here, right? I'm not actually getting any meaningful JSON back that I'm populating, but you see that I've already got a working prototype. Now before we move on, I just want to make a couple more points about the actual Ajax request that we're submitting. First is, notice that I'm submitting it to autosuggest.php. I'm not submitting it to search.php. Search actually does the searching. Autosuggest is a whole different thing. Its job is just to suggest things. It's not actually to go and search and present search results. It's separate. And then notice that it's also a GET request, that I'm getting back data. In the past, we've also had some code that would add a loading spinner. That would change the state of our application so that maybe something was disabled or we'd have a loading spinner while things were going on. I don't think that's necessary with autosuggest. We're just going to make the query in the background, and if we get back results, great. If we don't, that's fine too. There's no reason to let the user know that that process is going on. The results will show up when they're ready. Now in the next movie, let's look at how we come up with those results. In this movie, we'll write the code to determine which suggestions to return and send them back as JSON. We should talk about the kind of data that we want to use for our autosuggest. Autosuggest works best when we have large data sets, certainly over 100 records. It works even better if there's 500 or 1,000 or even more. And that makes sense. There's no reason to make suggestions if we only have a handful of records to pull suggestions from. In our case, we know that we're going to need data that contains more than one suggestion when we provide it the first 3 characters. It's not very useful to have autosuggest if when we provide the first 3 characters, it either returns no results or only 1 result. It's going to be better if it can return multiple suggestions when we give it 3 characters. In the real world, the kind of data that you could use might be product names, maybe it's a database of your customers, or it's article titles. You could really use anything. It's up to you. For our project, we're going to be using a data set that's made up of United States passenger train names. Let's take a look. I've included a file in the exercise files called uspassengertrains.txt. I'm going to drag it into my includes directory so we can take a look at it. When I open it up, you'll see it just contains a list of train names. So there was a train called the Abraham Lincoln, one called the Acadian, and so on. You can see that altogether there's about 700 names in this list. If we scroll to the bottom, you see there's 698 lines. So every name is on a new line. This file has 698 names in it. And you'll notice that there are a number of the names that contain the same first 3 letters. For example, if we were to give it WES, it would return suggestions for West Virginian, Western Express, Western Star, and Westerner. If we scroll a bit further up, let's find the word South. There's going to be several that have the word South in them. So as we type SOU, we would expect these to be the suggestions. Now as we keep typing, it's going to narrow those suggestions. So for example, if we type SOUTHE, then we would expect to only get back these suggestions. It would know at that point that it should only pull from those because now the E means that the other ones don't apply. If we typed SOUTHW, we would expect to get these 3 results back. You get the idea. So this is a good data set for us to use. So now let's actually write code that will use that data set. Now if you don't have access to the exercise files, then you can create your own text file, either from another data set or just by typing in your own names. Let's close that up, and now let's go into autosuggest.php and let's use that file as our data set. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to create an array called choices, and we're going to populate it with the data from that file. PHP offers us a file function that we can use, and we'll tell it that it should look in the includes directory for US passenger trains.txt. I'm also going to pass in an option to file, which tells it that it should ignore the new lines. In other words, we just want the text. Don't give me a new line as well. That's a common option you use when you're using file. Now this array of choices that I've got here is what I'm going to be using for searching. It's really a stand-in for what would probably be a database in the real world. Once we've got our set of choices, then we want to come up with a list of suggestions. And the way we're going to do that is by calling a function called search. We'll provide it the query. Remember, we figured out what the query was right up here. And we're going to provide it our array of choices. And it's going to do whatever work is necessary to return an array of suggestions. Then we can use echo JSON encode on our suggestions. And that will return JSON. So now we just need to figure out how do we know whether or not something matches. So let's write a function that'll do that. Function search. Let's also take query and choices as the arguments. Right above our search function, I'm going to paste in a comment that just says in the real world this would likely either search a database or you'd use a search program like Solr, Elasticsearch, Sphinx, or something else. Those are special programs that are geared towards returning search results as quickly as possible. So now to the core of my search function. Search function is going to deliver a set of matches. So I'm going to create an empty array called matches, and then at the end of my function, I'm going to return back any matches that we've come up with. So now what we need to do is populate that array with matches. And I'm going to do that by just going through each and every one of my choices, and each time I'll use the variable choice. And in that for each loop, we want to check and see whether or not the choice starts with the query. So if I'm going to add another function here called str starts with, and then let's use choice and query. Then we'll know we have a match, and so the matches array can receive choice. We'll come back and write this in a second. I just want to mention one more thing, which is that when we're doing searching, we should decide whether we want to do case-sensitive searching or case-insensitive searching. If we want to do case-insensitive searching, it's a good idea to add down case. I'm using string to lower to get a lowercase version of both the choice and the query, and then I can compare using d underscore query and d underscore choice. You see I've got those now as my variables. Now I'm comparing a down-cased version of both of those. Now if we didn't want to use down case, if we wanted it to be case sensitive, we could leave it out. But most times we don't care what case the user typed it in, we want to match it in a case insensitive way. So I'm going to go ahead and add that here. And in fact, it's slightly more efficient if I don't do this each time through the loop, if I do it up here. So let's just add that up there. We'll get the lowercase version of that one time and one time only. So now this str starts with function. We need a function that returns true or false if the choice begins with the query. You can write function str starts with, and let's use choice and query. Now, how do we do that? There are a couple of different ways that we can do that in PHP. One of them is using str. Another one is using a regular expression with preg match, but strpos is faster than both of those. That's the most efficient way to do this search. But if we use strpos, it requires that we use a strict comparison operator. Let me show you why that is. Return strpos. We're going to use the choice with the query, and we want to say equals with 3 equals to 0. Now the reason why is because this returns the position of the query inside the choice string. The position is 0 indexed, so it returns 0 if it's at the beginning. But the problem is that it doesn't always just return an integer. It can also return false when there's no match. And it can be a problem for us to compare false against 0. We can get a false match that way. So whenever you're using strpos, you always want to use the triple equals, the strict comparison operator. I'm also going to write another version of this function. Instead of str starts with, I'm going to call it contains. I'm going to modify this slightly to make it not false. So if we get any value back, any position at all besides false, then we'll know it was in the string. Starts with only applies if it is in the string, which means it doesn't return false, and it also returns a position of 0, meaning it's at the start. Now it's up to you whether you want your autosuggest to make suggestions if the string is anywhere in the name, or whether it's only at the beginning. So this is going to check and anchor it only to the beginning. That's typically what you see most people using. So if you go to Amazon, you start typing in books, then that's what it's going to return to you is books first. It's going to anchor it on the left side of the word. Contains would say if it's present anywhere in the text at all. You can try swapping out str contains down here so that you can see the difference, and you can try both of them and see which one you like. I'm going to stick with starts with. Okay, so now that we've written our two functions, search and str starts with, we should be able to get back a set of suggestions and be able to return those as JSON. Let's try it. Let's come back over here to Firefox. Let's reload our page. And let's just try south. Capital S-O-U-T-H. Now, I'm still just seeing alpha, beta, gamma, delta here. Don't worry about that. Notice down here the results that it's giving me back, right? This is the JSON that's being returned. That's what I care about. Notice as I type S-O-U-T-H-E, right now I get Southern Bell, Southern Crescent, Southern Michigan Express, Southern Scenic, and so on. Now let's try S-O-U-T-H-W. You see I get a different set, Southwest Chief, etc. So the JSON that we're getting sent back is correct. We're logging that back over here, right? Console log is just logging the result. So it's whatever comes back as the text is just getting logged for us so we can see it. What we need to do in the next movie is we're going to need to actually parse it and show those suggestions. But before we do that, I want to go back and just make a couple of small improvements here to our suggestions. The first is that I think it's a good idea if we sort those suggestions, and I'm just going to sort them alphabetically. That's what sort will do. The second thing I want to do is I want us to be able to set a maximum number of suggestions that we should return. I'll set it equal to 5. And then we can create a new variable called top suggestions, which will be equal to array slice with suggestions. We're going to start at the beginning of the string, which is the 0 index, and we're going to take max suggestions as the number of items. Now, when I return the JSON, I'm going to return top suggestions. So I'm going to find all of the suggestions, but then I'm only going to return the top 5 of them. Now, if you were working with the database, then you could do this sorting and limiting of the returns when you were making your query. You could do it all in one step. Here, because I'm not actually using a database, I have to actually write the code that'll do it. So let's save it. Let's go back and let's try it again. I'm going to reload the page, mostly just so I can clear the console. And let's try south again, S-O-U. Look at that. I only get back 5 records. There were more than that that matched. S-O-U-T-H-E. Notice that they changed suddenly when I typed the E. But I'm still only getting back 5 records each time. And they were already sorted in alphabetical order because they were in the file that way. So we can't really see that that's happening, but it is happening as well. Now that we have code that matches the partial search query against our data set, we're ready to actually take those results that are returned by JSON and use them to populate our autosuggest. In the previous movie, we were able to search through our data set, find the suggestions that we wanted to return, and send them back to the Ajax request as JSON data. Now we need to take that JSON data, we need to properly format it as HTML and put it on the page so the user can see it. Let's start by going into public.js, and I'm going to start out by taking out the place where we put in the fake JSON before. We don't need that anymore. We actually have real JSON now. So that real JSON result that comes back in response text will now be parsed into proper JSON, and then it'll be passed to the show suggestions function. Scroll up here. Show suggestions takes JSON as an argument. You can see that we already have some style information here that'll make the suggestions appear. What we need to do now is take that JSON and convert it into HTML. Let's just review what that needs to look like. Let's look at the header.php. Here's our suggestions that we created earlier. So inside our UL, we need to come up with li tags that have links inside of them that contain the suggestion text. I'm going to copy one of these just so that we have it for reference. Let's go back over here. Now I could just do that code right here, but I'm a big fan of creating new functions that do unique things. So I'm going to make a variable here, li list, which is going to take another function, suggestions to list. It's going to pass in the JSON to it, and that's going to return back all the HTML. And then we'll just need to tell those suggestions to take their inner HTML and just replace it with whatever we get back. Li list. So we should get back a list of LIs from this function. So this sole job of this function is turn JSON into HTML. Function suggestions to list. It's going to take an argument of items. That's going to be our JSON. And I'm just going to start by putting in that code that we copied a moment ago. I'll comment it out, but that's what it needs to look like, right? That'll remind us what the shape of this ought to be. Okay, so now let's go about creating that. I'm going to create a new variable for output equal to an empty string. And then I'm going to loop through all of the items. I'm going to add HTML to my output each time. And at the end, I'm going to return my output back. Okay, so let's do that now. Let's write a loop. We'll just use a for loop, I equals 0. And we're going to do it while I is less than items.length I plus plus, incrementing I. Now for each one of those, what do we want to do? We want to take the output and we want to append onto it an li tag. Actually, let's take this whole thing. That's a good way to do it. Let's take this whole thing, just drop it right in here, right? That would work, except that we need it to be a little more dynamic than that. I'm actually going to break it up a little bit more. Output plus equals. Let's actually just take all of this from here to here, copy it, and I'm going to break it again here, and here, and here. See how that works? I've just got it on separate lines, but it's really just doing the same thing as it was before. But now I have the ability to take alpha and remove it and replace it with items at index I. So the first time through the loop, that'll be items 0, items 1, items 2, items 3, and so on. Each one of my items will appear there. And I can take that same thing and let's put it right here after alpha. Let's break it one more time, but this time I'm just going to use plus signs. So there we go. Now we got the beginning of our link using search. Okay, so now we should have a list of all of our li tags with a link tag inside of them. Should have the name, and then it should close up those tags for us. Let's try it and see if it works. Let's save that page. Let's come back to our header and let's remove our placeholders now. We still want to leave the UL tags because that's our container that we're targeting. That's where we're going to put our li tags. So we want to leave that there, but it's empty to begin with. Let's come back over to the page. Let's reload it from the start. Start trying to type something. I'm going to try north this time. N-O-R. Look at that. It worked. I got my results. Let's try south again. S-O-U-T-H. Now I'm going to type an E. You see they changed. Southern. I'm going to type another E. Southerner. See how that works? I'm always getting my top 5 results back. Let's try Pennsylvania. A lot of the states yield good results. Let's try Detroit. Detroit and New York Express, etc. Let's try Cleveland. A lot of cities, a lot of states are going to return good results to you. Here's new for New York. You get the idea. And it works whether we do uppercase or lowercase. We could return more results if we wanted. At the moment, we're just returning 5, but we saw how easy it is for you to configure that to return more results. So to review, the way you implement autosuggest, you first create a text input. You make it so that it works with search. Then you style the suggestions that are going to go below it so that they look nice. And then you figure out what you're going to send as an Ajax request to the PHP page. You figure out how PHP is going to develop the right results. And then you send back JSON and use JavaScript in order to put that JSON on the page as HTML.